Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 279 of our regular shows, and we're recording this one on September 28th, 2024. This is the official podcast for the fan site, AvatarTheLastAirbender.online.com, and I'm going to be your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So on today's show, we have some news to talk about, and some of it's actually pretty interesting, but it won't take too long. And then we'll get into our main topic, which is the continuation of the last podcast, and that will be kind of part 2 of our Reckoning of Roku novel discussion. So we'll be going through chapters 16 all the way up to and including chapter 31. The difference. So we basically get up to just past page 240, leaving us with about a third of the book to go. Though, interestingly, with still like 20-something chapters to go, because there's a lot of short chapters at the end of the book. But we'll discuss that next time. So yeah, getting into the news, let's start off with, some publishing news. It's all publishing news, but this one is a new product that's been announced from Dark Horse, and that is Avatar The Last Airbender Omnibus Boxed Set, which sounds really interesting until you sort of look into the details and it gets a little bit weird. This is 5 out of 6 of the Avatar Omnibus, trilogy collections. So this is The Promise, The Search, The Rift, Smoke and Shadow, and North and South. But it doesn't include Imbalance, which is odd to just leave one out. When it's the Omnibus box set, the Omnibus editions have a spine image across all of them, and that includes Imbalance. I get Imbalance is a little bit different because it's done by a different creative team, but it is still a continuation after North and South, and it is part of the spine image as well. This is a very unusual product, even though I think if this was just all 6 of them together, it would be a really nice intro product. As it is, it just feels a bit odd. It is expensive, though, it's the price of 5 omnibus editions. It's 125. It'd be 150 if they did have the other one in. Most of the listings don't really specify this, but in the Edelweiss listing, it does say that it also comes with a poster. Don't know what it looks like yet, but apparently it's going to come with a poster. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it sounds cool. I mean, people like the collections of the sets, so if you don't have it, it's definitely a good way to get it all together. It does seem that it is odd that it is missing one, but I think it's really just they're going by a creative group, not necessarily the fact that they're just omnibuses in general, which, again, does seem odd, but I guess they really just wanted to sort of like stylistically flow together, especially considering how they're doing the box and stuff. And I'm sure the poster is by, this creative team, not the other creative team. So trying to keep it all together. But otherwise, it seems cool. It definitely seems like it, if you don't have any of them already and you want them all together, then this would be a way to get them at this point in time, at least.
Yeah, like it is simple in that sense. New people getting into the comics, it's like, get this, and then the separate Imbalance omnibus, and you're pretty much set for most of the Avatar comics. Everything else is one-shots and short stories, and then there's just 2 omnibus editions for on the chorus side of things, plus again some short stories. So they're making it easier to get into the stuff, which is good. It's out March 11th, 2025. So again, we are beginning to get the 2025 listings for books, though we're still waiting for most of the kind of big stuff, I suppose, more for interesting for later on in the year. But yeah, another reprint style book there. Then we get into the more sort of complicated piece of news here, and that is that the news effectively coming out of this is that Beasts of the Four Nations is still happening, but it's not like officially confirmed, but any news related to Beasts of the Four Nations is kind of big, massive news, just because the way the information's been about this book the whole time through, you kind of get a sense that, okay, that's just how it's going to be. Until Dark Horse finally officially start talking about this, it's always going to be the weird book that basically got officially fully announced for like years and then got cancelled and all this sort of stuff. But to quickly go over the information, Beasts of the Four Nations is meant to be a big hardcover book from Dark Horse Comics. It's meant to be part encyclopedia, part art book about the animals of Avatar. We don't really know a lot of details about it kind of beyond just like It's about the animals basically and some spirits. Because we never got more than like the cover and stuff like that. It was also going to be part of the deluxe set. That's probably the big thing, and the reason it's been kept kind of in the spotlight by the fandom, because this is the final part of a expensive set of books that also has like a spine image for the deluxe sets. This is meant to be the last one, and it's been years since the fifth one came out. So yeah, this was announced to us May 2021. Then it got delayed and delayed. Like, it got 5 or 6 different release date changes. Then it eventually got sort of silently cancelled, sort of postponed in the background. And we only found out, I think it was December 2022, that it had been like properly cancelled by the publisher. Pre-orders for it had been officially cancelled, but it was sort of awaiting kind of re-announcement. The title will be offered at a later date. And since then, we have not heard a single thing about it. So it's been the core of 2 years since we really heard something about this. And I'll go over what the new information here is on this. But before we get into the new stuff, where have you been at on Beasts of the Four Nations, given that it was so officially announced, but not like fully announced?
Yeah, I don't know, it's a weird one. I mean, out of all the ones that, were part of this collection, this one seemed like the cool one because it was something really different, and it's just too bad that it's been such sideline after all these years at this point. But it's interesting to get news in this sort of form and fashion, which is really, like you're saying, the only way that we ever do get anything about it.
Yeah, so the takeaway, I think, for most people before this was that some combination of COVID and just Dark Horse being badly affected by COVID and this being a completely new book, plus Avatar Studios also forming in or around the same time, and we know how that has affected everything else with regards to the switch to one-shots. We know that at least one Korra comic trilogy was sort of silently cancelled behind the scenes to make way for one-shots. A lot of stuff has changed just with COVID plus Avatar Studios happening, and it's some combination of that has probably led to this book being super heavily delayed. There is also the weirdness of just, for whatever reason, the listings for this book just, I guess, came out like basically a year and a half too early, because this was the maybe second or third deluxe book that got solicited, but it was meant to be the sixth one. So like we had to wait until afterwards for like the Korra book 2, 3, 4, second edition art book to get announced, and then this was meant to be it. So something happened, but it's weird because like it had official solicitations. Like we have full on, it's not like a leak that happened here. Like Previews World had it, most of the main retailers had it. It's an odd situation. But to explain the new piece of news here, the cover artist, we've known who the cover artist is for the whole time through. Devin L. Kurtz did the cover art for this book. She posted on Instagram with a completely unrelated post. Like what her actual post is basically not really relevant apart from the fact that it's Avatar related. She posted a piece of fan art, a couple of pieces of fan art of Dancing Dragon, basically. So it has animals in it, but it's just a piece of fan art from an official cover artist. Someone in the comments, a few comments down, says, "Whatever happened to Beast of the Four Nations?" Knowing that she, of course, is the cover artist. The cover artist replies saying, "I'm not sure, sadly. It got delayed due to the pandemic, and I'm not sure if it will move forward after all." The commenter replies saying, "Thanks, it's a shame, would have loved to have seen all the art." Then there's a reply from someone new called Julie Artwork, who's an artist, saying they are still working on it. And then Devin L. Kurtz replies to like Julie Artwork saying, "Oh, that's great to hear." And then someone who's actually one of my subscribers replied saying, "Hey, they're still working on it. Do you know this because you worked on it? Because this might actually be the first like official update on this book in like 2 years. It will be good to know that it's still in development." A reply was given, but then apparently deleted. But the commenter like basically DM'd me on Instagram kind of saying what it was. And effectively it is the idea that Julie Artwork is working on this book currently. They said, like, I don't know how much I can say, but like I'm literally working on something for this book right now. And that's the full situation. Let me actually just open up my kind of emailed directly about this. I don't know how much I can say, but I'm working on art for it right now. Okay, so that's all that was said, but it got deleted then. So we know that the book is still happening because there is an artist doing work on it this month, basically. It tells us absolutely nothing about when the book is going to come out or theoretically come out, especially because the idea of like this is like a 200 plus page book that we expect to have like all new art. So, you know, one potential piece of art among many, but I assume there's a lot of work being done here because I think if you look at Julie Artwork's page, very heavy focus on kind of animal pieces of art. So you can maybe get the sense why they were brought on board for this book. But what are your thoughts on this oddly fitting, kind of vague piece of information confirming the existence of this book once again?
Yeah. I mean, this feels like this is just the pattern of this is just, every couple months or whatever, we get some sort of information that this still exists and is still being worked on in some form or fashion, which is good to know because I think people are still, for those who, have followed it and stuff like that, they're still invested in it, and it does sound like a cool one to have out of like all the ones in that grouping. So I don't know. I think it's cool that there's something coming out for it, maybe, but still sort of in the air.
Yeah, like there is a lot of interest in it because people love the animals of Avatar. We've never really had a proper encyclopedia type book. Like some of the extra books have been like partially like that, a bit of a fact file type thing, but they've never attempted to list out all or most of the animals. So there was a big interest in this because it would be the first like completely new hardcover book from Dark Horse in a long time since the original release of the book 4 art book. So it was always going to be like a cool thing whenever it happens. It still will be because, of course, it's not just going to be available in the deluxe format. There's going to be a standard edition of it as well, digital edition, I assume. It's just we still really don't know what the format of this is when it comes to like how much. My big thing is probably how much text is actually going to be in this book, actually like describing the animals. Like, is there going to be lore here, or is it just going to be more like a big art book about the animals? We're not super sure on that sort of situation, but it's really good to know that there's at least some positivity about it when it's actually going to happen. It definitely opens the door to like, I've always just like when speculating about the upcoming Comic-Con conventions, always been just like, well, hey, Beast of the Four Nations, they could mention it, but it's probably not possible. Now all of a sudden it's actually like, wait, well, we know it's being worked on, so it has to be soon-ish, so maybe we might get the announcement. But anyway, final piece of news is that we have the panel announced for New York Comic Con 2024. So this is happening, the con is happening October 17th to the 20th, and specifically the One Avatar panel, there's only one Avatar thing, is happening on Friday, October 18th, 6:45 p.m. to 7:45 p.m. in room 1C03. The description is, it's the Water, Earth, Fire, Air, continuing the Avatar Legacy panel. Abrams Books, Dark Horse Comics, Nickelodeon, Webtoon, and Magpie Games are thrilled to treat fans to a panel worthy of the Avatar. Join publishing's creators and writers of Avatar and Korra to explore the beloved world. The so far announced panelists are Cara O'Neill, the typical moderator, Ethan LeBlanc, who I think if you look up is from Webtoons, James Mendez Hodez, who's from Magpie Games for the RPG, and Randy Rabai is also going to be there. So that covers someone from each of the 4 main publishers, and we'll see if anyone else gets added to the roster. So we're once again getting our standard publishing panel. As ever, the description never gives anything away, but there's stuff expected here. But what are your thoughts so far on the one announced panel?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's the sort of standard, publishing panel with sort of the usual cast that we've sort of seen over the last couple of years and stuff like that. So I don't know. I'm sure it'll be, something of note, that'll be mentioned there. Maybe it might come out a day before, maybe it might come out after, sort of officially on the internet or whatever. But yeah, it seems like it's sort of the same fare that we've kind of come to expect, which is, it's good that they're still having it. It feels like it's a lot later than it's ever been in other times. in terms
Mhm.
of like scheduling. So that doesn't bode well for me personally. Just thinking about, things that get pushed to the end usually aren't sort of as important.
Mhm.
But it's cool that they're having it at least.
Yeah, they did this for SDCC as well. The publishing panel was actually quite late, which I think was particularly
Hmm.
bad because the time difference between San Diego and here is very,
Oh
very
yeah.
bad. It's not so bad for New York though. This is like basically what, like it'd be 11:45 to kind of midnight 45 my time, so that's not too bad. So yeah, and again, just really briefly, like news we're expecting. Abrams, like Awakening of Roku, maybe cover. Like the description, I guess, is probably gonna maybe get updated on websites in or around this time, maybe. But I actually don't really know what Randy Rabai is going to talk about here, because they never overly preview upcoming books. They never overly review sort of books that have already been out. So it's just like, okay, he's going to be here. The book, I guess, is still only a couple of months old. You want to get the new author out there constantly. There's still that aspect of it. But in terms of news, not really sure what the novel stuff is going to be. Do you have any kind of expectations on the novel side of things?
Honestly, not really. I mean, you said the cover, that would be cool, but even that, maybe not. But I don't know. It feels like it's still a bit ways for them to really talk too much in detail about that.
Hmm. Yeah, and then we're realistically at some point maybe expecting Abrams to start to do more novels and like there to be another kind of series of Avatar novels at some point. Is it going to happen now or more like maybe next year leading into Avatar Studios? We don't really know, but there's always the chance for announcements like that, but it's hard to speculate on them. Dark Horse is where they really do need to deliver because, again, they never are going to focus on reprint books that much, so they might mention the omnibus set, but they're not going to focus on it. Uh, they've already, in my mind, done like way more preview stuff for Mystery of Penkan Island than they've done for any other book just because of how delayed it's been. There's nothing else to really talk about. The cover's out, the description's out, it has a release date. We've had like 2 batches of preview pages. There's basically nothing else to talk about except for that book to actually just release. So I would almost be like, I think there's kind of an expectation that we maybe get the next Korra comic announced here. Because if they don't announce it
Mm.
here, we have to wait until like SDCC next year, which is a pretty long time away, and that'd be like 5 months after the release of Mystery of Pankan Island. So it's kind of, if they don't announce it here, it's not going to get a convention announcement, that sort of thing. But the big one we'd probably be expecting is the next Avatar one shot because the 1900 T Brewer is out. We need to know what the sixth one is, and that's the one we're going in like 100% expecting. Like you have to announce what that is. But what are your expectations on the comic side of things?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I always want them to do more and, sort of go back to sort of the format they had before. But I think, like you're saying, if we can get some of the, Avatar, the one shot, the final one of that one, which I think, there's a lot of different ideas on what it could actually be. That would be like ideal for that one. And I don't know, anything, I mean, yeah, with Michael's one, I don't think like you're saying, there's not going to be much more of that one that we really want to see. Like, unless they like give like a con exclusive to actually see, more that's in it or do some sort of like mini live read or something like that. But even that, I wouldn't really expect something like that, not with the people that they have there. So I don't know. I don't know. I think there's a lot they can do with it, but they feel really sort of hamstringed right now with what they can do in publishing.
Yeah, and then we just mentioned Beast of the Four Nations, so like it's suddenly on the table again. Basically, it's been a waiting announcement for the last 2 years. Is now the time to do that? Like, what is the plan now to release that book? Is like, are we going to do it now? Is like the last big book before Avatar Studios, or will it be the first big book under Avatar Studios? Um, who knows? But it's at least a possibility once again. And there's not as much of a pressure on like, can someone please like confront them at the Q&A to ask them about it anymore? Which they don't seem to do Q&As anymore, I guess, to avoid stuff like that. But uh, again, comics, we would probably expect some sort of expansion because, again, it was Cara O'Neill who said publishing is going to ramp up coming soon. So that's the other thing with this panel is like this is the first one since she said that. So Are we expecting bigger announcements here or more for next year? We just don't know. Um, then we have a Webtoon. And again, they do have someone here. They had the Webtoon person at SDCC. And the main thing with that was just that they opened the door to the idea that they could potentially do original content on Webtoons in the future, but they didn't like confirm it. It's not like a concrete statement of like there will be original content, but it's kind of like if we're adding Webtoon to the publisher, surely that's why we're doing it here, because otherwise, like, are people really that obsessed about getting information on when the the webtoon version of a variety of different comics are going to get released? Because that's the only other thing they have really is like, how are they doing the core comics? How are they going to do the short story and one shot stuff? Because they already are doing the trilogies in order, and that's kind of just boring because we already have it. And in the same way, like, they don't talk about reprint stuff. This isn't the most interesting thing. Even if, like, business-wise, I guess it's good that more people are reading the comics because of webtoons. It's not new, really. So, I don't know. What are your expectations with webtoons now being added to these panels regularly?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure they'll announce like, their sort of outline for putting stuff up, which they've kind of already done before. So that's not really, anything new like you're saying there. But I do know, it is pretty big. People do use it as their main sort of source for comics and stuff, and it is free. So like, there's an audience there that's really sort of into it, and people who haven't seen it before. So it's definitely worth it for it to be there. But I don't know. I wouldn't really expect anything sort of extra from there. The idea that they might do something new, that if that's even a possibility, that seems pretty cool. I wonder how much they would really go for that. That feels like something they would do with like sort of the new stuff that they have or that they're coming up with, as far as like properties in order to like tie it in and stuff like that. So that definitely is a cool possibility for the future and stuff if they really sort of go with that.
Yeah, because even when Avatar Studios starts, like, it's still going to be like months, maybe like a year between the big projects. Publishing, even if it ramps up, it's already not like in a super like tons of books get released each year state. So there's going to be like giant gap period soon, and I think we've always wanted some sort of a weekly kind of release type thing, a monthly release like mangas get. It would be cool to kind of have a super regular style release thing that webtoons could offer. I guess it's just about finding the right people and the right story to do it with, but I hope they can do something like that, because for like people like us, the webtoon stuff is just like, oh hey, it's another way to get people into the comics, but it's also like kind of a weird one to recommend because you're basically telling people to either wait weeks and weeks for books that have been out for like 10 years, or they pay for the early access to stuff, and even then, like, you only get like a couple of issues ahead, and it's a weird system. But yeah, that's webtoon. And then finally, Magpie Games are in a bit of an interesting spot where the Uncle Iroh Adventure Guide is beginning to ship out now to people. Like, they've sent out the notifications about that. Like, the book is out. They've effectively opened up like the official pre-order for like the mass release. So by the time we get to New York Comic Con, like, they'll still be in the middle of that, but the book is basically done. So it feels like they have to move on to what's next. And as far as we're aware, what's next is two things. One, the obvious thing, is the Spirit World book that we're expecting, probably a settings toolkit like the Republic City book. That's what was announced when we first heard about the RPG. They kind of delayed it to do the Uncle Iroh book, so I'd want them to get back around to that. And then there's a random thing of the Roku Voyage of the Unity Kickstarter thing they're doing with that other company, Beetle and Grimm, which we have like literally no information on it, but I'm assuming it's a few adventures and a bunch of physical stuff. They might talk about that here, but again, that's more a different company than super heavily with Magpie. So I don't really know what the situation is there, but they're probably in a situation where they need to say something, because they've, I think, had a few conventions now in a row where they haven't really said much. But do you have any thoughts on Magpie and what they might do at this panel?
No, I mean, other than what you've just mentioned, Really. I mean, I don't know. Their stuff is always interesting because it adds a little bit of, extra lore, and we do get stuff from it that we can sort of, take from it as sort of like official sort of stuff. And, it does get used in other properties like the book we'll talk today. But I don't know. Nah, not much more on them.
Yeah, because I really think if they want to release a big book, they probably do have to introduce another era. Like, if you like the Yang Chen books, if they were to do Yang Chen's era as a book, that would be kind of exciting. People have been, I think, asking since launch for like Wan's era, which would probably require a lot of specific work with Avatar Studios to flesh out that kind of era a little bit more, but would allow for, I think, a very interesting book. But we have to see what their plans are, is because we're expecting Magpie to probably have plans for Avatar Studios as well, because they're going to run out of stuff to do the big books on, where like, okay, Spirit World book, then what? Like, what are we going to do after that? Are we going to do like Zhong's Adventure Guide? I don't think that's not maybe going to be super exciting. Do we do like Bossing Say Settings Toolkit? How far are we stretching this is the big question after that. They eventually have to expand. But yeah, that's happening in a couple of weeks, and we are expecting some news, potentially more than we expect, depending on when the ramping up is happening. They might even detail like that next convention, the conventions next year might actually be a bit more exciting. But that situation. Kind of interesting, there's no podcast panel, but the podcast is going to be in a bit of a weird situation because they're basically finished season 3. They're doing their kind of final few episodes. I think on Monday the final episode, Sozin's Combat Part 4, comes out. They are, I think, going to have an episode after that, and probably 2 or 3 more. But by the time we hit New York Comic Con, they're probably wrapped up on season 3, awaiting announcement for like the Korra seasons, I guess, or whatever their plan is. Do you have any thoughts on that? Just like the main run here of the podcast sort of coming to an end, and what your expectations are for how they're going to tackle Korra potentially.
Yeah, that's interesting that they're really coming to it. It seemed like it would take them forever when they sort of started, but they've kept chugging along, and people really seem to be into it. So that's cool to see. I don't know. I feel like they could do something special for Comic-Con if they wanted to have something sort of random there, even if it isn't necessarily like episode focus or anything like that, because it's cool to sort of have them there just as like another Avatar thing there that sometimes there's some news that comes out of it, sometimes there's not, but it's sort of the staple, and it has people that have been directly involved with the show, so that's always nice from that sort of perspective. But yeah, I mean, as far as what they're going to do, I mean, I don't know, it seems like it's pretty popular, so I would be surprised if they didn't keep it going, especially since the people on it are were actually Janet Varney and them were in the chorus, so like I'm sure that would be ideal and stuff like that. So I don't know. I hope they keep it going just for the people who are really into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I also would like to see it kind of evolve to be more kind of news focused, and that like, okay, they're getting the Avatar Studios people on, but it would be nice to get the Avatar Studios people on with the idea that there actually can be news and not just like stuff's coming, like we work with you, but we're gonna act like we're just fans here, and not that we have this like exclusive access that no one else has. It's an odd situation, but yeah, we'll move away from the news into the discussion for Reckoning of Roku. So this is for the middle third of the book. We're starting here with chapter 16, which is on page 121, called Bones in the Earth. And we're going to go up to chapter 31, called The Difference, which is like ends on page like 242 or something. So yeah, where we left off, basically, Gyatso and Roku are beginning to kind of become pretty close friends. Malaya is having a bit of a kind of crisis in terms of like the truth of her position within the clan, and is heading back to meet with Ulo to kind of learn the truth. And Sozin is on his way to Wan Chi Tong's library. So there's actually some pretty big setup stuff happening, and we'll jump in here with chapter 16. So Bones in the Earth is Malaya returns to the village, and she goes to speak with Ulo. When she gets there, he starts talking about one of the clan's stories, their history, about what happened to the Ibalon clan, who were wiped out by waterbender outsiders arriving to kind of destroy the place. So continuing the kind of dislike of outsiders here. We again get more questioning of the details of the story. Last time he told it, it was like a different river and some of the names were different, that sort of thing. Is there any truth to it? She's kind of thinking, was it the outsiders that did this? Or did the various clans on the island like attack each other, and maybe this is just a way to add to the narrative that we all hate outsiders. So then we get to her kind of questioning kind of Ulo over the idea of like, do the earthbenders deserve to die? What Amihan said about we kill people, is that true? And yeah, the deserve to die statement is met by anger by Ulo, who kind of viciously freezes her in ice out of nowhere, highlighting how skilled he is, the power. They are just about in the cave system at this point, so that links into things later on. And he's like, do we deserve to die? And yeah, he basically confirms that, yes, their policy is to kill outsiders because, in his mind, outsiders only ever come to the island to basically take from them and attack, and that even the mother and daughter that Malaya views as just being here for information, knowledge purposes, probably are going to give that information to someone else in the future, and they'll come to the island. And so he sends her back to Amihan with the idea of like, will you do what you need to do for the clan? And she has to say yes, but she really doesn't want to believe that this is actually the truth of the situation. So her fears confirmed here, but what are your thoughts on Malaya in this chapter?
Yeah, I mean, this is the sort of full sort of realization of how sort of the inner tribes of the working of the tribe actually sort of works here. And, her being a new scout is definitely something that she hasn't experienced. And Uno says as much. He says this is the first time, outsiders have been on the island since, she's been a scout. So, of course, this would be her sort of first experience with this, and she seems like it has an actual heart, compared to a lot of the other people who have been become scouts and have aged over time. So it's interesting to see this perspective, and of course it's our younger character that's having this sort of crisis of fate here in this sort of situation here. And Ulo's definitely the hardened person who's been around. He's the only one who's been outside, so he of course knows the real things, even if she is sort of questioning things here. But yeah, it's definitely something of note to see this sort of darker side of this tribe that we thought was kind of okay. Like, they seemed like they just wanted to sort of be alone and left alone, and they were more sort of defensive. But here you can see that they in some cases they can take some sort of direct defense on certain situations here. So it's definitely something to see when this sort of comes fully out there, and even how sort of this cave sort of works, and sort of the realizations you get by the end of this chapter as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting chapter because, yeah, Malaya gets it confirmed that this is the role of the scout. Part of it is to kill people. That there's no real nuance or questions to this. Like, Ulo just kind of points out that, like, historically, everything points to outsiders being bad, and as we'll get into in like future chapters, it's a kind of valid point about like he's fearful of like colonization and stuff like this, and it is kind of historically correct basically that he feels that way. But the net perspective of just kill all outsiders, no question, is a big problem, and to really just advocate for that, and it's a tough situation. He tries to be understanding of her situation, that like, oh, it's admirable that you respect life, but this is the way it just has to be, and you can see the issue here. And then it is kind of interesting as well, just like Ulo snapping here. It's like the only time he really does this outside of like the final fight in the book, that it takes something like this happening to make him like attack a member of his own clan, of just the idea that almost Malaya in his mind is caring more about the outsiders than her own people. But as we sort of see with Malaya, it's because she sort of feels a bit detached from her own people as well, because of kind of everything that's happened. It's an interesting dynamic. But we from there go into chapter 17, which is called Under the Altered Sky, which is a pretty quick chapter where it's effectively Roku and Gyatso wake up and they're sitting under the stars, basically, and they note that the stars are in a different position because they're in a different part of the world, and they just each share the dream that they had that night. With Gyatso, he has a very kind of mysterious dream that is almost like him seeing the future to a certain degree, because like he sees the air temples burning, he effectively quote unquote sees his own future death in the future, and like the idea of he was almost forced into a situation where like, what if I have to kill someone to defend like the air temples? And he's also dealing with the idea of like his own failure to airbend, and what if something like this happens and he can't airbend at the right moment. And you get a sense of what Gyatso is thinking about through all of this, while it being sort of connected to what we know of Gyatso in the future in a kind of weird way. With Roku, he has a more direct kind of setup for his backstory here of like he dreamt about swimming with Sozin and his brother Yasu. And Gyatso's like, wait, why was this a bad dream? And the idea is like it was bad because he woke up, because that didn't happen. That's not the reality of this memory. That's what he wanted it to be, but it obviously went wrong. And they're giving you an early hint as to the details of sort of what happened to Yasu without being super direct. But that's most of what this chapter is about. But what are your thoughts on this one? I suppose especially the kind of nature of Gyatso's dream.
Yeah, no, I definitely picked up on that 100%. I was like, is this like a premonition of the future? Is this like, him having some sort of early, spiritual connection in order to see stuff? Because it feels like it's very sort of direct. And I don't know, I think this one, it's a clear sort of call out here, but it didn't, this one, and I think there's one other one in the section we'll talk about today. They didn't really irk me too much as being like too much sort of, that sort of stuff. So I thought this, it feels like it's something that, even him as sort of like a young person struggling with his sort of airbending at this current point in time, might actually sort of have, like, what can you do? And especially, when we do learn his sort of backstory and sort of what he's already dealt with, it kind of plays into that as well. And then, yeah, Roku is definitely like a nice sort of, offset foreshadowing of, his actual backstory without, really getting too deep into it. Is, a nice moment that's only, downside is that it didn't really happen that way.
Mm-hmm. Chapter 18 is called Delicate Political Maneuvering, and this is more of an action set piece. So throughout a lot of these chapters, Roku and Gyatso are kind of like moving along. They found the tracks. They're following the Earthbenders effectively. And here is where they finally encounter one of them. So they're basically ambushed by a tall earthbender who kind of starts off with this rock slide and then continues to sort of like swoop in, kind of flying along on a rock and trying to ambush them. But in a weird situation, he seems to be very specifically like targeting and wanting to attack Gyatso more so than Roku, which is kind of odd. And they have to figure out like, wait, we don't want to kill him, but he's trying to kill us. How do we do this without like absolutely like ruining him? And they manage to eventually work together. Gyatso's airbending does in fact work because they're in a kind of life and death situation. And Roku kind of sets up a situation as he kind of passes by them, and they end up sending him sort of like tumbling down a bit of a cliff face. And they think he might have killed himself, like almost smashing headfirst into a rock, but he more damages his shoulder, which we'll hear about in like the next chapter. But it's a nice enough I think fight scene chapter. It's it's probably the first time in the book where you, I think, really get a sense that, oh yeah, Roku is a master firebender. He has this like lack of confidence arc, but he is actually, we've been told this, like he's the second best firebender of his generation, basically, just after Sozin. It's just that he's not super confident in himself. But you see him doing this like amazing fire sphere shield to basically block a full rock slide, kind of hitting him. And then he's actually decent in like the tactics of this fight and like directing Gyatso on what to do. So, when he actually focuses on things like this, he's pretty good. But What are your thoughts on this action chapter?
Yeah, no, he is really good. And there's been maybe like one other instance where he's like using some moves that seem like they're, master class level. But yeah, he definitely feels like if he's only working on fire, he's like, top of the game because that's what he knows, and he sort of needs to sort of rein it in sometimes, as we see later on. But yeah, no, this is definitely a good sort of, I guess, place to sort of see their skills and their ability to sort of like work together in tandem. There's a couple other times where we get to see just sort of like a duo sort of working together, and it's always nice to get to see that because it's definitely, it's another way for our characters to sort of connect, without sort of the more sort of like heavy interpersonal stuff. So, it's good from that sort of side, and it's just interesting to see that they're getting attacked by this person randomly out of nowhere, and they think they're Yasuo's making sort of half jokes about the giants and stuff like that. So like there's a good bit in here, and it's funny just because this it's supposed to be delicate and political and stuff like that, but this is of course the exact opposite.
Mm-hmm. And if you've been paying attention to every single aspect of the book, you'll also kind of make the connection here of like tall giant earthbender, and then Amihan in one of the previous chapters has mentioned like randomly to Malaya, oh, is this because of what I did to the giant earthbender? And she's like, you did what to who? And we'll get it alluded to, I think, in a chapter coming up as well, that they'll mention that like you killed 3 of our guards, and it's like, wait, we only know of 2 deaths, and this is the quote unquote 3rd one because he was separated and is badly injured, that sort of thing. So there's some fun stuff like that, but we move into one of the first like big chapters of this chunk, and that is chapter 19, Another False Avatar. So the Earthbender wakes up. We eventually get that his name is Owen. And first of all, we have to deal with his dislocated shoulder. So we get an interesting kind of lore reveal about the airbenders that because of their training involves height so much, they often have dislocations. So a lot of them know kind of medical techniques related to like relocating them and popping them back into place. So Gyatso is able to help Owen here. They then start to interrogate him. They first have to get past the barrier of, wait, we are not who like you think we are, because he's convinced that Gyatso, the airbender, tried to kill him. But Gyatso has to really work to convince him that, no, I'm a peaceful air nomad. I've not attacked anyone. Like, we've just arrived here. I haven't fought anyone up to now. And this is the Avatar. I'm just like with him as a companion on this mission. And eventually they do manage to convince him of that. But he also kind of doubles down on the idea. An airbender definitely attacked me, which is why I have these kind of slash marks all over me. And he also mentions that another reason he was injured is because he was sent like flying into the air as well, which is her signature technique, Amihan. He says he is a private security guard for the Eastern Kingdom Trading Company, and that they are primarily here to investigate a special rock/mineral ore that is on the island. So this is a massive reveal in terms of like the plot, in that like, okay, for sure, it's not the Earth Kingdom army that's here. It's a trading company with a private security force. This is why there's only like a scout force rather than like a full army like Sozin alluded to in his letters and stuff like this. So this helps to sort of highlight, okay, all of the groups are here for very different reasons, and these are going to like cross over as we go through the sort of rest of the of the book. But what are your thoughts on the initial kind of interrogation sort of scene here with Owen?
Yeah, it's not necessarily the greatest sort of interrogation here, especially with the reluctance of the Earthbender here. But yeah, I mean, you can see, he's, when he's been through a lot at this point here. So, I think it's pretty justified that he was pretty sort of hesitant, considering everything going on, and considering, I don't know, it's interesting that he's so against sort of airbenders from this sort of like one instance that he's had where, we're assuming that, he's been around for a while. He's not like a youngish type character. So he probably, has knowledge of just, the Air Nation in general, that they're, generally not sort of aggressive in attacking, but he seems fully on board with like, if there's an airbender on this island, then they're trying to kill me and they should just be taken out, immediately. Which, considering, the one that got to jump on him before, maybe that's justified, but, it might just be, these type of, security guard type characters have that sort of mentality. We can just sort of go with that. But, like you said, eventually they do able to get some information out of him, even if it is pretty reluctant, even if he doesn't really believe that, this kid here, who's 16, 17, is the new avatar that, hasn't really been announced to the world, which I guess that kind of makes sense, especially considering, how big the Earth Kingdom is. And I think, later on, they talk about sort of, did you know, Yang Chen, or, the previous sort of avatar and stuff like that, Kyoshi, why would you know that? But, essentially he might have been around during that time and that how big the Earth Kingdom is. So, information and traveling, especially during this era, probably doesn't go that fast. So, I guess that kind of makes sense that, they wouldn't necessarily know who the new avatar is, especially, since, Sister Disha keeps saying Roku's not ready. So I guess that kind of falls in line with that. But yes, interesting sort of attempt at interrogation here, and Roku trying to sort of be impressive, even though he's still not really confident in it. But he's acting that way. He's trying to do what sort of Sozin and sort of Yasu would have done.
Next, with this information in mind, Roku and Gyatso start to argue about what this means, because they reflect back on what Sozin told them, and clearly he didn't mention a rock or an ore. And so Gyatso kind of connects the dots here and is like, oh, Sozin must be here to get this ore for the Fire Nation. That's why he lied about it, because he doesn't want to come across as like the leader who just wants to kind of mine the place effectively. Gyatso does get frustrated that Roku continues to sort of defend Sozin on the idea of like, but he's my friend, he couldn't possibly do anything wrong, basically. And it starts to get a bit kind of intense, especially when Gyatso suggests that maybe Sozin sent the assassin who attacked us. And Roku gets quite angry at this suspicion, even though we as the reader know it's actually true. But it's not true that Sozin is here for the rock mineral. He's here for something else, of course. And then we get into like a really big argument. Gyatso immediately wants to leave. Roku wants to stay and sort this out. Gyatso feels that, because it's just about kind of resources and because the Eastern Kingdom Trading Company is involved, I don't want any involvement in this. I don't think you should be involved as the Avatar either. And when Roku kind of defends this on the idea of like, we need to stay to save the Earthbenders so they don't get like killed by the natives, basically, because they've already heard that Owen has been injured by one of them. Gyatso just responds and says, well, greed has its price, as in like, let them get hurt because they're part of this trading company. Roku's a bit sort of stunned, but then Gyatso continues and is like, Roku, you're a noble and you don't care about all the little people who make the things that you as a noble kind of uses and buys. And, you're from the Fire Nation as well. You're an oppressor. Your people are oppressors. You're nothing like Kyoshi, who actually kind of knew what it was to be in a low position like that. And maybe you're not good enough to be the Avatar. Maybe you are just another false Avatar. And this is a very heavy blow against Roku. So they just full on kind of split up at this point. Roku calls Gyatso a failed airbender, and the two storm off in separate directions. With the idea is that Gyatso theoretically is planning to kind of return home, but Roku's planning to continue the mission. And it's all falling apart very, very quickly here, and mostly over Roku defending Sozin is the main topic here. But we haven't really got into the details here. But it's an important plot point in the book, this argument here. But what are your thoughts on what happens in the second half of this chapter?
Yeah, this is unfortunate, but this sort of classic sort of temporary sort of friend breakup. That sort of happens from time to time. And I think it's there's definitely some points here that are very sort of valid, and they sort of brought this up throughout sort of the book. How Roku is he's a rich Fire national noble, so like he has these advantages, and he's been they made a joke before about sort of the pleasure cruise and stuff like that. So he is sort of part of that class of people that wouldn't necessarily be sort of down there with the little guys and stuff like that. So I think the fact that it has some truth is really what sort of hurts Roku in this instance here. And yeah, he does make the jab back about sort of Gyatso being sort of a failed airbender, but Gyatso can still airbend. It's just sort of blocked. So I think that, even though it hurts, I think you get that from Gyatso. It's not sort of as meaningful as far as, sort of, I guess if you want to say who's winning this sort of argument here. Granted, their information and sort of what's really happening here as far as the bigger picture still isn't really, understood by either one of them. So there's still that to consider here. But, it's a hurtful moment on both sort of sides here, and it's definitely something that, they will have to eventually get over.
Yeah, I like the nuance of this because, as you say, some of what Gyatso says is sort of valid about Roku, but not all of it, because Roku is not the obvious representation of I think a privileged noble. I think Roku, you can clearly see, has done a pretty good job about adapting to a giant change in his life from someone who kind of just wanted to live a normal life, but he's been pretty okay trying to do his best going through this, given that he's not the most confident person in the world. So for Gyatso to kind of lay into him about this, when I don't think there's really been any evidence from a lot of the scenes that they've had up to now of like Roku represents what you're talking about, and they kind of highlight that in the text of like, it was as if Gyatso had stabbed him with a blade he'd long been sharpening in secret, so that this is like a speech in a way that Gyatso has been prepared for a while to deliver to someone, and it just happens to be Roku he's delivered this to. But we don't even fully know the reason why he's delivered it at this point. The connection here is obviously the idea of Roku defending a leader who might come in, colonize a place, and take all the stuff from it, which relates to what happened to Yama, as we will get to. But Roku doesn't know that sort of context up to now to be more understanding about it, and that causes like a lot of the issues here as well. And then I just find it very interesting that they have turned Yoon into like an insult against like potential avatars. Like just like it's this devastating blow against Roku that he's called a false avatar because of Yoon, basically. That's harsh because of the tragedy of that character, but historically I guess that's the idea that they're going for here. But this is definitely one of these things where like as we go forward, like Gyatso will apologize for this first, so like you can tell that the focus here is more that it's a really shocking and surprising thing that Gyatso has just kind of let loose, kind of gotten very angry. That's the surprising thing, more so than like Roku being hit with a lot of truths necessarily here. It helps Roku along his path, the few bits and pieces of it that are kind of valid, but it is also the case that some of it isn't. So it's a very interesting situation that they do here. But from there, we go into chapter 20, which is called Control. So we're back with Sozin this time out, and we get an interesting one here, where this is like the final chapter right before Sozin goes into the library. So he's escorted the final leg of the journey by sandbenders, and the whole time through the chapter he's suspecting an attack from the sneaky sandbenders and is on guard. He wants his teammates on guard. When they stop for a rest and some like tea and stuff like that, he thinks this is their opportunity to attack, so he preemptively attacks them. But it ends up getting revealed that actually they were just resting and serving them tea. The sandbenders weren't actually trying to do anything to Sozin, and he is objectively in the wrong for attacking them and injuring them. And so he doesn't really admit to any wrongdoing, but he pays them like double basically for the mission here to get them out into the desert. And then they basically arrive at the spire, which they note is not kind of the library isn't buried as much as it was when we saw it in ATLA, which is a fun little detail. It's still mostly buried, but you can see more of it, which makes sense. And the final detail is just that Dalasai wants Sozin to look for books on metallurgy while he's in there, because for whatever reason Sozin has decided only he is going to go in. The other two, so Kozuru and Dalasai, can't come in, because the whole control situation of this chapter is that he needs to be in control when he's around other people at all times, and he got it wrong with the sandbenders and even his potential friends here. He doesn't treat as friends and won't let them come in because he's suspicious of them, and he can't let Dalasai have access to the library information because she might be a problem in the future, is the sort of implication here. So you see a little bit of sort of quote unquote paranoid Sozin here. It's maybe not that extreme, but it's getting there with him. But what are your thoughts on this chapter for Sozin?
Yeah, no, this is definitely the beginning of Sozin's sort of paranoia and sort of mistrust of everyone, which I don't know if he necessarily had any trust to begin with, or, not that much. Like, he trusts them to do, what he sort of paid them to do and stuff like that, but not much more beyond that. And yeah, I mean, I think, the whole idea of like not directly sort of admitting your mistake feels like sort of your classic sort of evil type leader type situation here. So, that's sort of maybe the early lookings of that here. But yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a nice sort of, switch on sort of what you sort of expected to sort of happen in this situation, especially if you've watched the original series. So of course, there's that whole aspect of it. So, that's a nice sort of callback there, as well as just the library in general. That's like, when that was mentioned, the last time we were doing this, I think that's, a cool thing to sort of get in mind. So no, I think it's a nice sort of quick, just sort of traversing chapter and showing us things that we sort of knew before. But yeah, I mean, I think, in this sort of situation, it doesn't surprise me that he's sort of going in alone, just because he's really focused on what he can do to help sort of the Fire Nation, and even more so just himself in the Fire Nation, like not even necessarily the whole thing. Like, I think, we'll get to the point where he talks about, what he could bring back, and then, to sort of what he actually does sort of, bring back in terms of information. So there's sort of that conflict there of what he's really trying to do there. And even the whole idea of metallurgy is, it's cool that we sort of get mention of that. And, we've heard, before, stuff about the metal and how it's different in instances like that. But, it's interesting to get these sort of, little nuggets that we just happen to have a person with us on the Fire Nation side who's also into this sort of stuff and can do stuff with this information.
Mm-hmm. Next chapter is chapter 21, a mutual exchange of information. So we're back with Malaya here. So on her way back to Amihan, where she's thinking like, oh, am I going to have to kill people? Or she pretty quickly comes to the solution. How do I stop Amihan from, following through with the orders? And so along the way, she actually finds a basilisk centipede, which was actually mentioned earlier on in the book. It has a poison that paralyzes people. So she quickly kills this to get the poison. And then she just appears next to Amihan and is just like, oh yeah, I'm back. You were correct. Hey, here, I got these bananas. You have one. And so Amihan then starts talking about, okay, so this is how I'm going to take them out. And then she collapses to the ground paralyzed. So Malaya has poisoned Amihan here. And then she decides, I'm going to go talk to the mother and the daughter earthbender because they're going to be reasonable and I'll convince them to kind of leave. So she's finally going to go ahead with her quote unquote idealistic kind of plan here of just like, oh, I can talk to them and we'll see if that's going to work. But what are your thoughts on the first section of this chapter of like Malaya deciding to kind of go against killing the outsiders and actually stop Amihan from doing it?
Yeah, I mean, her heart's in the right place here, to sort of protect the life here and ones who don't necessarily seem like they're going to sort of harm things and, might be reasonable in this sort of situation here. And, I think it's a cool call out to the animal and sort of how to use it. And, her skills in general, I think it's always neat when we get to see the highlight on her sort of, abilities that she has and things that she's learned over times, sort of being in this environment that, other scouts might not even know, who are, much more veteran than her, but she's able to sort of get the upper hand in this situation. So, that's always a cool bit on our sort of younger characters here to see how, skilled they actually are.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, from there, she actually goes out and just full on appears in front of the mother and the daughter, who do quickly introduce themselves. So we finally get their names. The mother is Yu Ming and the daughter is Chija. So they're like, oh, a native, let's get talking. And they immediately see her as like, you can tell us all the information about the island. She's like a research subject effectively to them. And immediately Malaya wants to be like, hey, you're in danger. you need to leave because the clan wants to kill you. I've just protected you from the other scout, but she's going to get back up eventually and try and kill you. And she's incredibly powerful. Like, your guards will not be a match for her. And they just won't believe it. They just won't listen to what she has to say. And instead are just trying to kind of recruit her to sort of guide them around the island and point out all the unique stuff. And Malaya is just getting more and more frustrated. They're kind of getting frustrated with her because she's not doing what they want either. But once she full on refuses to kind of go with them, Chija earthbends Malaya kind of into place, kind of locking her down. They don't hurt her, so they just kind of lock her in place here. And they leave. They're going to go ahead with exploring the island, even if they are likely going to get into danger when they actually encounter the rest of the natives because of the clan's policy to kill outsiders, which is what Malaya is trying to protect them from. So the kind of chapter ends with the idea of Malaya's kind of naivety kind of pointed out here. Her idealistic view of just you can talk to the outsiders and convince them hasn't quite worked. She sort of feels betrayed because in her head she's kind of thought of them as being the very reasonable outsiders, but at the same time they didn't kill her, so like it hasn't ruined her view of outsiders. It's just it hasn't gone in the exact way that she wants. So it's an interesting sort of nuanced situation, highlighting the complexities of everything going on. But what are your thoughts on this chapter here? Effectively, the introduction of Yuming and Chija as well.
Yeah. There's a lot of different sort of facets to this, and from her Malaya's perspective, she's doing the best thing here, and she wants them to sort of get away. But the mother and the daughter, they mentioned how they've already been through so much. They've taken them forever to sort of find the island through the fog and everything like that, and even just sort of traversing this terrain with the fog around is something that's very hard to do. So they see all this effort that they've put in, and they can't just sort of let it go, which is from a perspective is understandable. Now, is it worth necessarily your life or something like that? No, I don't know. But they can't necessarily or understand the sort of danger that's involved here. And Malaya's not necessarily, maybe she's not explaining it the best or anything like that. But again, it's just it's a hard concept, especially when they probably already see themselves just being in danger by being on the island. So how much more danger is it? I don't know. That's sort of the situation that they're trying to sort of figure out in this situation here. But yeah, I think it's good that at least they don't try to sort of take her out or harm her directly, which is exact opposite of what the guards would do and what they eventually do. So yeah, there's a lot that is going here, but I think at least her whole view of outsiders isn't completely ruined, like you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Next, we go into big chapter here. Just from the name, you can probably tell that. Chapter 22, Roku Alone. So this is going to be a pretty big one. We're going to get some backstory here. I'll split this up slightly differently just so we do the present day part of this chapter separately, which is pretty simple. It's just Roku on his own, upset after the argument with Gyatso. He obviously thinks Gyatso was way too harsh on him here. And the thing that really gets to him is the idea that he was called a false avatar. And he's like, no, I am the avatar. I'm going to prove myself. He continues to kind of trek along the island. He gets higher up. And eventually he kind of slips and falls after it starts to rain. And it's meant to represent this idea of he's the false avatar because he's viewed as having failed all the time. And the backstory represents one of those failures. And then here he is just trying to trek across the island, and he's also failed in a sort of similar situation where the weather has gone bad. He's fallen off the island, off the cliff, but he wakes up and he's in this cave system, and he randomly notices that his bending is oddly powerful, but he is still lost in a cave system and he doesn't really know what he's going to do, but he's going to try and still continue on as the avatar. So that's the kind of the present day side of the story, and this is happening while he's having the very negative views of his potentially biggest failure so far in his life, which was what happened with Yasu. So that's the kind of angle they're going for in terms of the setup for why he begins to kind of tell this backstory. So, in terms of the present day stuff of this chapter, what are your thoughts on Roku on his own, walking across the island, and then his fall off the cliff here?
Yeah, I mean, this feels very sort of, on point for this sort of, introspective sort of situation that we find our sort of main characters involved with. They're always sort of, going somewhere on some journey, trying to achieve some goal. But they're having struggles in the real world while reflecting on the struggles that they've had in the past. So, I like that sort of, back and forth, that comparativeness of what's going on and what sort of happened before. So I think it's the title, it sort of goes along with what we've seen with our other characters. There's a little differences here and there, and I don't know. I wonder if this is something that we're it's just like an Avatar sort of staple that we're always sort of going to get this on sort of our character sort of journey, which, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a good way to sort of, learn about our characters and have an info dump and, sort of have them sort of come to, some sort of realization by the end of everything. So it's cool to get to see, Roku's version of this.
Mm-hmm. And then the backstory itself. So this happens when Roku, Yasu, and Sozin are all 12 years old. The setup here is that Roku and Yasu are going to go swimming in the ocean. Sozin was meant to be there, but he got in trouble because he damaged stuff while trying to bend blue fire, which is a nice little detail that he's always been after those kind of rarer techniques, and he even got in trouble for it once. And they note here that Roku is particularly happy to be invited to one of these things because since they started at the Fire Academy, he's felt like he's been kind of drifting away from the group. It's a trio, but at the Academy it seems like Yasu and Sozin have sort of taken off. He stayed in place, and there's been more instances of just Yasu and Sozin going out on their own, and Roku kind of really doesn't know where he's heading to next, so he jumps at the opportunity to join his brother and Sozin on this one, but it's just the brothers in this case. But he's still happy. They note the weather is raining. It's not great, but it's not awful at the same time. So it's a pretty normal kind of situation here. We do immediately get the characterization that Roku and Yasu are sort of opposites. Roku's very cautious, not confident. Yasu is very confident and is very much drive ahead. We just have to do what we want to do, go ahead with it. So you can see why Sozin and Yasu especially kind of linked up quite well. And the big situation happens here where Yasu swims ahead, kind of in a way challenges Roku to a bit of a race. He heads off ahead. Roku's hesitant, he can't quite keep up, he's a bit behind, and then sort of out of nowhere the weather picks up a little bit, a sort of big wave comes in, they're both pushed under the water, Roku comes up, Yasu doesn't, and this is effectively the death of Yasu. He just kind of gets lost at sea here while they're out swimming, just a random wave hits them and he doesn't come back up. Roku searches, panics, trying to find him, but he never does. There's a pretty nice sequence that's Roku's just kind of in shock on the beach as more and more help arrives and no one can find him, and then there's the confirmation that yes, Yasu's been lost, there's not going to be a body for the funeral, and it's this sort of shocking moment, but it's also very normal for a tragic main character, backstory death, in Avatar. Just lost while swimming is kind of very normal, but it's also very kind of hard hitting at the same time, because you can see, I guess, it affects the kind of community quite a lot because it's a noble son basically lost here in this incident. So what are your thoughts on this reveal of what's happened here? There's the clear setup earlier on in the book that it was related to water, likely during some sort of a swimming trip, but that it kind of very much is the obvious thing here. Well, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you could say it's definitely sort of obvious here, but I think it's, it also has, a very sort of meaningful impact, not just to Roku, like you're saying, but also to the community as well, just because of how, I guess, sort of, maybe influential or just, sort of who's of people here, and how sort of, connected this group, these two brothers were in the Fire Nation, as we get to see about, throughout the whole sort of funeral here when they do get to that. So it's definitely, a tragic moment here is felt it by everyone here. It seems like they have like a big search in order to try to sort of, have some hope of, recovering this lost sort of brother here. And, they make note of, how generally, this wouldn't be sort of like, this would be like sort of a joke thing that the brother might do because he is generally considered a pretty strong, sort of swimmer here, as opposed to Roku, like you're saying, he's more sort of timid in most of these sort of situations. So yeah, it's definitely sort of a heart-wrenching situation that sort of, just throws a whole lot of, sort of questions into things as well, just because this is sort of his twin here. So, people sort of think of them as, one and the same here. So there's that whole sort of aspect of things that, is always going to be thought of for the future here, especially for those who, knew that there was two and that there's only one now.
Yeah, it's so interesting as well, just because you add in the fact that, like, I guess Roku hasn't been known as the Avatar at this point yet, or it's sort of unclear, like how long ahead of time do the Fire Sages know who the Avatar actually is. But the idea, like, if Roku really did get into trouble, would the Avatar state activate to save him? So, like, Roku couldn't, in a way, have possibly died in this situation, because we have, like, evidence of this exact thing happening with Aang and stuff like that. That's an interesting situation. But yeah, I actually really like the fact that it is this very normal kind of mundane situation that just goes awry, because it adds to this idea of, like, Roku considers this his failure because he was the only one out there with his brother. His brother was lost, he wasn't. And it links into this big moment during the funeral, which we'll get to in just a second here, which is that, yeah, we cut then to the funeral. As they note, there's no body to burn. So instead they burn kind of key items from Yasuo's life to sort of represent him. And they even discuss the idea of, are they even correct? Like, he himself probably would have chosen different items than other people have to choose, like, for him. It's this real tragedy that they don't have his body there to kind of represent him. And Roku notes that he feels like he has lost half of his spirit with the loss of his twin. And then we get to addressing, like, okay, what's the family situation like in the aftermath of this? They've lost a son, Roku's lost his brother, and this is why there is no relationship with the parents here, is because of effectively what happens here. His parents don't directly say it or blame him for what happened, but in essence, that seems to kind of be the case. His father kind of says to him that, like, you should have saved him. As in, like, you weren't good enough. Like, why didn't you do something more in this situation to save him? And it's the idea of, like, the mother and the father are together grieving, but, like, they're a family. Like, he's not involved in that. Like, they're not helping him. They're helping each other. And, like, that is a bit of a problem, like, that makes you raise your eyebrow about, like, ooh, what's going on here? There is definitely, I think, some blame there. And it's this moment that effectively is why he doesn't have much of a relationship with his parents, and why he didn't care about getting letters potentially from them earlier in earlier chapters. I guess his grandmother was maybe the only family member who actually, like, cared about him in the aftermath of this. But instead, the person who kind of saves him in this kind of devastating moment is actually Sozin. Though, admittedly, there's an initial moment here that's not great, where Roku goes up to Sozin and says, I should have been lost instead of my brother. And Sozin doesn't directly, like, disagree with this or say anything. But then he does eventually kind of say the right thing. He is the only one who's really, like, there for him. He says, we can only look to the future. Be who Yasu would have wanted us to be. Roku says, I don't know who I am without a brother. Sozin says, I'm not Yasu, but we're brothers too. Roku, never forget that. We will always be brothers, always, until the very end. And we suddenly introduce into this idea, the idea that, oh, Sozin has lost one of his two only friends. And now he is even more driven to sort of protect the one remaining one, to the point where he effectively considers Roku a brother going forward. And this is where the the thing that we knew about ahead of time coming into this book, the strength of Sozin and Roku's friendship, it only really became as strong as it was in this moment, kind of with the death of Yasu, and Sozin feeling like he has to grasp onto the one thing left in his life, and Roku needing someone to to be in his life, like Sozin, when his parents weren't really there for him. So this is, to me, definitely one of the best scenes in the book here in terms of just the emotions. This funeral scene, I think, is really strong in terms of the emotions, the characterization. But what are your thoughts on the funeral?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely, one of those moments in the book that definitely can hit deep for you because you definitely get sort of the read on how everyone is dealing with this loss of life and how, they're attempting to sort of cope with it. And of course, Roku is not doing, well with the situation at all. And, up until, sort of Sozin sort of seems to step in, it doesn't seem like there's anyone who's really, looking to see how he's feeling about the situation directly, because it definitely feels like, sort of like what Roku's getting, that, sort of out of the two of them, the one who was more outgoing and sort of excitable and sort of involved with things was the one that was, a bit more favored of the two. And, Roku's just sort of left to be there. And, he even notes that on himself in terms of like what his interests are and what, things he wants to be sort of involved with. So it's, something of note to see sort of our, main character in this sort of, depressed state at this moment in time, and, is able to at least find some place where he's able to sort of draw some strength from his, essentially, third brother here, out of the group that was three here. So it's definitely something of note, and it definitely feels like it definitely pushes them together, like you're saying here. And, there's a lot of, what ifs in this situation in terms of like what could have been if the brother still was around, would Roku and Sozin have been this close if this, loss of life didn't happen, what could have been, but, we can only sort of, speculate on that. We just can see sort of what has happened on the situation here, and it definitely feels like this is something where Sozin himself, even if this is such a sad situation, this is where he has his own personal drive to keep moving forward and to continue on as he thinks other people would have wanted him to be. So you can see his strength of resolve, strength of character in this moment.
Yeah, and this is why Roku defends Sozin so much, is because he really was the only one there for him at like the worst moment in his life, and there's no ulterior motive in this situation from Sozin. This is just they're friends, so it's an interesting presentation there to know that like there is a real friendship there, even given everything that goes on to happen and all this sort of stuff. But that is the situation. But yeah, it is interesting to speculate about, if Yasu was alive, like what would the dynamic have been, that like Roku gets announced as the Avatar while more so Sozin and Yasu are best friends, but then Taiso would still want Sozin to be like, hey, you're kind of friends with Roku, focus on that a bit more. And then how would Yasu react to his best friend suddenly focusing more on Roku? That could have been an interesting potential dynamic. And I suppose that gets more into the dynamic we almost expect there to be when the Avatar has a sibling, that kind of jealousy kind of angle, which they haven't done yet, and they kind of avoid really doing because of they kill Yasu off before the announcement of Roku as the Avatar. Maybe in the future we'll get something like that. Next up, chapter 23 is Terrifying and Tempting. So we're with Roku here. He's walking through the caves, doesn't really know where to go, but he eventually makes his way effectively to the sacred cave. And from a distance, he sees three waterbenders standing up on the kind of hill in the center of the sacred cave. What's interesting is that these three waterbenders are, of course, wearing old style Fire Nation clothing. And he quickly figures out that, wait, what they're doing, they're not obviously bending anything. Wait, there's kind of fog in or around the edges. They're making the fog, but wait, that doesn't make any sense. Like, to bend fog around an entire island, you would need like hundreds of benders. And then he is like, wait, my own bending is empowered being here. The cave must empower bending in some way. I kind of need to figure this out. This is likely another reason why people want to go to the island. And there's a lot of confusion over like, wait, who wants the special ore, who wants the power, and is it both? You know, a lot of these questions begin to come up at this point. Either way, he realizes that he's kind of accidentally stumbled into a bigger mystery he does need to solve as the Avatar. He can't just leave, so he was kind of right to kind of come here. So he eventually steps up and feels like, okay, I have to talk to these waterbenders to try and negotiate. But the second he announces himself, they attack. And of course, they powerfully attack with enhanced water. But he defends, because he's a skilled bender, with enhanced firebending, but he has no control over it. So we get this really cool moment where he accidentally does a sort of fire kind of sphere defensive thing, but it's all blue fire. And we, of course, this is effectively the canonical reveal that, yes, blue fire is hotter fire, because when you're empowered, you can do it easier. So it's a kind of cool reveal here. They then start to fire water streams at him, and he's kind of pinned down. So he decides that, okay, I don't want to just fire like fiery death at them that I can't control. What if I raise the temperature to melt the ice? But he overdoes this and basically turns the cave into like a furnace, and so he KOs everyone with like heat stroke basically here, and nearly kills everyone including himself. But thankfully people arrive, because of course the fog going down with the three waterbenders out causes a bit of a chaos on the island. So they're going to be okay. But first proper introduction to the enhanced bending here I thought was like super cool. Because I like to go in depth on bending and how it works, this to me fit everything with like my understanding of like bending enhancement and stuff like this. So it was kind of cool to see that all kind of work out really well. That yes, of course, yeah, he doesn't have control, but he's skilled. And yeah, it's just everything goes up, so he has blue fire, but he doesn't have control. That makes a lot of sense to me. But what were your thoughts on this chapter? And I suppose the effective reveal of bending enhancement is part of this.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we've sort of been waiting to get throughout this whole sort of book here, so to actually get to see it and how it sort of plays out. It's a pretty cool, visual, sort of way of, understanding how, both sides of the bending water and fire are sort of enhanced by the cave, and how, they're able to sort of control or not control it in this sort of situation. Because if you just, all of a sudden get like a boost to your powers without really, understanding it, of course you're going to be, sort of a little clumsy at the least. And you can see, Roku has some sort of grasp that, he's enhanced, and that, this is going to be, something that he needs to sort of work at, and you can't just, do everything in the world with his, bending abilities that he normally would. He has to sort of, tame it down a bit. He just doesn't sort of tame it down enough in this situation here. And he makes the sort of allusions and comparison to sort of like the Avatar state, and being enhanced with that sort of bending power, which he hasn't experienced yet, so he doesn't really know. But he's sort of he has like the readings and stuff of past avatars, right? So like he understands the power that he one day potentially will hold. So he has this sort of idealistic point of reference of what it might sort of be, and is this how he's currently sort of using his just his fire bending that he has up until this point thought he had a really good sort of mastery over, but we can see here that it's just a little bit too much for him, and he doesn't have sort of the training. I mean, I wonder if a sort of like a fully realized avatar would have a better chance at controlling their power in this sort of situation, because they've already have that sort of like extreme level of power, where I think it would be interesting to see like what's the comparison point. Is this stronger, is this weaker, or is this sort of like on par of that sort of power there? I don't know if that's something that we'll ever sort of find out, but it's just it's interesting to see this sort of situation here, and where Roku finds him, and how he's just not able to control it, and even just a little bit sort of knocks everyone out and himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the interesting point, is that like they really highlight the idea of like in seeking better power, the big thing you need is like better control, to actually control it. And we'll get the explanation in like a chapter or two that like it takes the natives here like practicing from a young age, gradually being introduced to the energy to get to a point where you can like safely control the enhanced bending overall, because otherwise, what happens to, like I say, a Sozin would probably happen to your typical firebender, cause it's so aggressive. But yeah, it's super interesting the way it's described, of like he immediately walks into the cave and just he can feel within his body the energy is just like humming, and that like he feels like he could do anything. And I think as we get later into the descriptions and stuff like that, he knows specifically that, like, yeah, I can turn my fire different colors. There's moments where I think they even allude to the idea of just he's charging up an attack and it starts to crackle with electricity, even though he's not specifically trying to lightning bend, but like he has so much power, it's happening by default almost, which is interesting to kind of think about, because that's, I think, most of the way we consider a lot of those techniques is that, like, yeah, you need to train up, you need to have the power to be able to sort of access those techniques, but then to actually like control it and not just do it kind of in a crazy fashion. So it's I think it's really well done bending enhancement here throughout. And I suppose, speaking of that to a certain degree, we go into the next big chapter, chapter 24, All for Nothing, which we're back with Sozin, and we finally go into the library. So basically he goes in, pretty quickly he meets Wan Shi Tong. It is noted here that he is the first Fire Nation person to be in the library since Avatar Zito, which I think is a very cool detail. The knowledge that Sozin submits to get in is Roku's diary, which they note he had like Kozaru steal ahead of time, knowing he would need this to get into the library, which is a little bit of an odd point, because like, you're the prince of the Fire Nation. Could you not just write some document and like give it in as a piece of history? Why do you need to steal Roku's diary? But I guess he wasn't sure how important it needed to be. And then we get an interesting thing with Wan Shi Tong, where like he knows for some reason that Sozin didn't read it. So there's some special power that Wan Shi Tong has when it comes to knowledge, that this is maybe the first kind of inkling of, he just knows things that he maybe shouldn't, or somehow, which is kind of interesting. But Sozin says all of the right things to Wan Shi Tong. Like, he reads from the right script to get him good with Wan Shi Tong, to the point where Wan Shi Tong seems to love Sozin coming out of this. He says, like, you can come back whenever you want, so long as you demonstrate some of these techniques that you learn to me. And so we'll discuss when he gets in there a lot of what he learns about. But what are your thoughts on Sozin speaking to Wan Shi Tong here?
Yeah. I mean, Sozin definitely, he's, even if he doesn't like interacting with people to some degree, just because of how people normally act to him as being the Prince of the Fire Nation, he knows how to deal with people, and it seems like that transfers over to spirits as well. He has, such a way of flattery with the owl here, and I guess this is, I don't know, maybe bad guys are just really good at giving flattery to spirits and stuff like that, or maybe the owl's just really receptive to it. I don't know. Maybe the owl's just sort of like a low-key, always sort of, bad spirit, or he's just, only cares about knowledge for knowledge's sake. He doesn't really care about how he sort of gets it in any sort of method, which, is just sort of how the owl just sort of operates here. He just wants to know things. He doesn't necessarily care how he gets it. But yeah, Sozin definitely knows what to say. He has sort of the right thing. He knows that he has to give something. And I don't know, I think, Roku's journal, that does seem like that's a very sort of, prize thing that Wan Shi Tong would sort of accept. So I can kind of see the reasoning behind Sozin, wanting to use something like that. And of course he knows about it and has, a way of getting access to it. And considering what we hear, just coming up about sort of the other things that other avatars have given to Wan Shi Tong in terms of, entering the library, in terms of knowledge. No, this seems kind of like on point there. I don't think, necessarily a document that he would have would necessarily be, a high enough standard, although I think he could have taken something from the Dragonbone catacombs, and that probably would have been, on par with something that might necessarily be worthy of being in the library here. So there definitely are other things that he could take, because, considering we're trying to consider, we keep going back and forth about, Sozin being like a really good friend to Roku, maybe not such a great friend. This is one of those times where it's like, maybe he's not, sort of the best type of friend ever considering this sort of situation. But no, that's not as, bad as some of the other things. So I don't know. It's going both ways here. So as we keep seeing how, Sozin eventually becomes what he becomes.
hmm And yeah, one of the first interesting details is that Wan Shi-tong mentions that, like, oh, you're already a master firebender, but Sozin's like, oh, but there's surely stuff that's been forgotten over time. And Wan Shi-tong mentions that I have scrolls on the Dumog and Eskrima firebending styles that your clans forgot long ago, and I would like to see them revived, basically. Now, they don't explain in the text what these styles are, but it's one of those ones where if you look up those words, and especially with the Randy Rabai being the author, they're like Filipino fighting styles, and I think one of them is like knife and weapon based, and then the other one is like wrestling, grappling based, which is interesting to think about, where like there's already a little bit of the kind of knife fighting stuff almost involved in certain firebending moves that we've seen, but the wrestling, grappling firebending, I'd like to know what that's about in terms of like that direct contact. Is it just super close up firebending, or what are we talking about here? It's just an interesting little detail that's presented there. Do you have any thoughts on just those two things?
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting that you say that because it feels like some of those elements have probably been, sort of assimilated into sort of like your standard firebending techniques, because we do see, like you said, like the sort of swords and the daggers, like we've seen that in terms of, just them creating that sort of with their fires, and some of the firebenders that are more proficient with like hand-to-hand sort of weaponry and stuff like that. So we see bits and pieces of that, and even sort of like the grappling and stuff. Like we've seen some instances where firebenders do wind up getting really close, that they do have some techniques for that, but it's not really sort of like part of their standard, sort of fare of moves or stuff like that. So yeah, no, that would definitely be, cool if that was ever explored in more detail. I hope they do.
Yeah, because like it's one of those things where you almost wonder, like, say, like I think Iroh doesn't he like throw Azula in some sort of a kind of judo-esque
Yeah.
throw at one point? Like to a certain degree, like is Zuko's breakdancing kind of move that he always seems to do quite well with, is that like related to this at all? Because it's kind of up close. Who knows? It'd be interesting to know what the full details on that are. But then there's a cut in the chapter, and we just cut to like, okay, he's been in the books. The knowledge seekers are just giving him book after book. Everything he wants is here. And the way they do this is effectively they list off a bunch of stuff that Sozin knew previously as a legend, and what's been confirmed is true, and then a list of things that have been confirmed to be kind of false, and then the big sort of story-based kind of beat at the end. So straight away what they do is they effectively confirm pretty much every firebending technique you've heard about as like a legend is an actual technique. You can learn them. There are scrolls, there are like all these sort of things in the library that can help you to learn these things. It's just going to take many years to learn each of them. And they note that like what's here is like how to increase the heat of your firebending, how to turn your firebending different colors because of the heat, how to do lightning, how to do lightning redirection, how to heat the temperature of the air or distant objects is listed here. The fire flying technique of like, kind of jets out of your feet is here. First dragons are mentioned, breathing fire, and they even allude a little bit to the Yang Chen books with a life-threatening procedures developed to where you can do combustion bending, and many, many more. And they just highlight that not many people have mastered many of these techniques. Even like a fire avatar like Zito, who had many of these powers, they don't list them specifically. But they're even weird about, like, he knows some of them, and then because he's the Avatar, he's used some of them in the Avatar state, which is an interesting distinction, which we've always wondered about with, like, lava bending for a lot of Avatars. They kind of talk about that here. Yeah, we'll get into the comet stuff in a second, but what are your thoughts on just the way they present firebending techniques here, and the fact that Sozin's going to have to now pick and choose what he wants to add to his arsenal?
Yeah. I mean, time is always sort of against you, and he seems to be very sort of aware of that, and I guess probably because he's already a master of some degree, he understands the sort of training involved with this, and how it can sort of change, and I guess sort of the way that you do things when you're sort of learning these different sort of techniques in here. But yeah, it's definitely it's cool to see them sort of list through the techniques, and which ones can be used which sort of ways, and how they were developed, and what other sort of references. If you've been reading the books, a lot of this stuff you're sort of already aware of, but I'm sure some people won't necessarily be aware of everything. So it'll be cool to sort of see people to get to figure it out through this, sort of one instance here. Even some things such as like lava, and sort of who can do it and who can't do it. There's a lot here, and there's all this that he could learn if only he had the amount of time. But he has to prioritize to some degree.
It's interesting because they mentioned earlier on in the book that Sozin remembers everything he reads, so he knows about all of this stuff coming out of it. But he's also given access to go back to the library whenever he wants, basically, and he doesn't break any rules as far as we're aware. So he can just come back if he needs to. So I suppose the big question is which techniques do you think he actually focuses on? Because I think there's been a lot of discussion about this, about like, okay, clearly some of them at some point get introduced into the royal family afterwards, but like, for instance, say like lightning, we don't know Sozin knows lightning, but like it kind of feels natural that like he learns it here, he learns it himself, and the family afterwards kind of go on to have it as a kind of signature move. But what specifically do you think he actually focuses on from the list that we get here?
No, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, the lightning would seem to be sort of the obvious one. But it doesn't seem like the redirection was sort of part of the key thing, because it doesn't seem like Ozai was really prepared for that sort of situation. So it feels like definitely more on the offensive side of firebending sort of techniques here. I mean, I guess the propulsion one, that seems like one that would also be sort of passed around as well, because we've seen that done, even if he had to be more enhanced by the comet at the time. So that would be another one that I would think of. I mean, the color one, I guess, but I don't know if we've seen him do that I can think of. But maybe in the next book, who knows?
Mm.
So there's, stuff like that where I could see it being, stuff that's passed down. I mean, if he really is sort of remembering all of this stuff, or he comes back to sort of learn it to some degree, it seems like, I mean, a lot of these could seem to be passed along, even, the breath of fire, right? Like, we
Mm.
know one of them knows that as well. So that could be, but I mean, it's, for him to master all of that, I mean, would he really spend the time to do that? I don't know. He seems like he's a very sort of like learned type of leader, right? So
Mm.
it could really be in his preview to actually sort of do this stuff. I mean, even sort of the whole, with the lava and stuff, since we do know that, he's able to convert, sort of the magma sort of steam and sort of output it on the other side, right? So like he has that sort of innate understanding. Now, is that from certain techniques that he learned here, or is that just because he's a master firebender, he's able to sort of manipulate, sort of any sort of fire or heat energy
Mm.
in that sort of way? I don't know. I don't know. There's a lot here that he could sort of techniques that he could sort of learn and pass on. I don't know. Maybe he does his own sort of addition to the Dragonbone catacombs for the next sort of generation to figure out on their own.
Mm. Yeah, because it's interesting because, of course, we've seen Sozin's fire and it's not differently colored, but they do highlight that, like,
No.
you can enhance the heat and then you can also enhance it to the point where it changes color. So maybe he does a little bit of that so his flames are hotter, but like he didn't spend a ton of time to the point where it changes color. Whereas, like, obviously, like with Azula, it's clear that she obviously chose to focus on that from a very early age, and they're just her natural color flames now, to the point where like we never see her do normal fire when she firebends. That's interesting. I think for him, probably the idea of like the heat, like you can change the temperature of the air, distant objects, because he, like you said, he does that kind of he he turns lava into land again by sucking the heat out of it. He does like heat redirection. So he obviously has some sort of like heat focused skills. So I could see him maybe focusing a little bit on that. And then yeah, the fire propulsion thing feels like, well, like I guess he brought that back into play. We just don't see him specifically use it, because most of the time we see him, it was like one fight where he didn't even get an opportunity to do it, and then fighting on the volcano. I guess it was so hot it probably wouldn't have really done anything potentially. It just probably wasn't useful there. And then, yeah, I'm guessing stuff like, say, Breath of Fire, he just view as, that's kind of spiritual nonsense or something like that. I don't need that. And then, of course, it's way too dangerous to try and become a combustion bender because he's probably going to die. Because the procedures is basically drowning yourself. So, yeah, I love all that stuff. Definitely a little bit of controversy about the idea that Iroh is no longer the, like, original lightning redirection inventor here, where they do establish that it is a historical technique here. I don't mind that too much. It's one of those things where it's like, I don't think we need an ancient practitioner of every new skill, in the sense that, say, like, I think we're all pretty fine with Toph being the first ever metal bender. Like, do we need to have an ancient metal bender, or should we commit to her being the first? So I'm okay with, like, lightning redirection, where it's clearly just like an alternate kind of skill related to a bigger skill. It's just part of the lightning family of skills, whereas, like, yeah, she's the first ever metal bender. I'm relatively okay with that. But what are your thoughts on them adding kind of that sort of retcon into play here?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, for people who are fans of Iroh, I can see why they would be a bit upset with that. But in terms of, like, techniques and when they're developed and over time like that, like, I don't know, I wouldn't necessarily think that he would have been the inventor of that for, like, all time. I would have thinking of him being sort of like the first person in a long time to sort of like rediscover that talent and that technique and to sort of pass it back on because of his just general understanding of firebending and his sort of spiritualness and his personality in general, that he's able to incorporate things from other sort of cultures. Like, that just seems like his character and his personality. But if there are other older cultures that have been around for a while, and as we've seen on this island, they are ones that have been working in community with different type of benders together, there would be some bleed over in your sort of techniques and your mentalities and your ways of doing things. So that seems like something that would be passed around in that sort of community, because there's already other people of different sort of bending skills in your area. Like, he had to go and observe waterbenders during an era where there was a war where they didn't really like waterbenders. So, like, that's a very sort of like unique Iroh type of thing to even be able to sort of do, that we know from the past was a normal thing, that there would have been mixed communities of benders. So I don't know, that didn't really irk me too much, from that sort of perspective. The metal thing, I think it, depending on, like, sort of the era and how the Avatar world developed over time, like Industrial Revolution and sort of, techniques and stuff like that, and metallurgy and how that was developed, the idea of there being, of Toph being the first sort of metal bender doesn't really bother me too much. But at the same time, like, I wouldn't be surprised if, there was someone who was a metal bender before Toph and just no one knew about it, or they forgot the technique. Like, that could have happened just as easily as well. But, the abundance of metal being in an area where someone's able to sort of develop a technique, that's sort of something that you have to sort of consider. At least that's what I consider in my mind. Like, yeah, this clan has, their own specific sort of metal, right? And they have their techniques on sort of, forging it. But, are there earthbenders involved in that sort of process? Because it seems like the firebender was the main one that was involved with it. So, there's sort of instances where you're trying to, like, make up in your mind when did these sort of situations possibly happen. So I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if things happened earlier on and we just didn't know about it, because things get lost in history. Like, this whole island was sort of lost to history until it's been revealed now, right? So
Mm.
I don't know. That's how I think about it.
Mm. Yeah, and then with like metal bending specifically, it's one of those things where like it's very related to like technology. So like there's probably a super low chance of there ever being a metal bender in like Juan's era or immediately afterwards, just because how much metal is there around for that to even be a useful technique that much? Whereas like obviously in Korra's era, where like a lot of stuff is made out of metal, it's really easy to find it to like test on, and it's actually useful in battle because someone's probably wearing something made out of metal. Like you just the building beside you has a strip of metal you can tear off and fight with. Whereas for probably the first couple thousands of years post Juan's era, it's not the most useful thing, and so Toph maybe being the first one as we get into metal becoming a much bigger thing because like there's machines now made of it. You can see like a technological reason for that. Also, I think through the history of like lightning generation, you can sort of tell why like yeah there's not often like a linear progression of these like how these techniques are thought. Whereas as far as we're aware, lightning has kind of appeared, disappeared, and it's not necessarily this kind of continuous like I learned from this person learned from some person. Because a lot of people are asking like, but what about Zhu Ping An? Like, did he not teach anyone? Did the Earth Kingdom get the information on that out of him? Potentially not. And it's actually Sozin who brought lightning back because he went to the library or something like that. It's probably the more likely thing. And so yeah, Iroh kind of learning the technique on his own in a vacuum is just as valuable as like the first ever person who learned it. It's that sort of idea. I think it's just, I think for a lot of people, it's just like, you don't want to do that with maybe every technique. Like we don't need ancient metal benders, ancient blood benders in every single kind of capacity. You know, you got to let a Hama, a Toph sort of be unique to a certain degree. But we'll continue on. He then switches from firebending techniques to firebending enhancement, and we address, first of all, interestingly, solar flares also empower firebenders, but you can't really predict like them occurring, but they do empower firebending, which is interesting. I think that's a really old lore thing from like the original series Bible, but like it never came up anywhere else, so it's nice to get details on that. And then of course we get the address thing that like yes, nearby celestial objects like comets do empower firebenders, and specifically the Great Comet is going to come at some point in the next let me get the details on this right. What does the book actually say compared to what's correct? I think the book says 44 years, isn't it? But it's wrong. Yeah, the book says the next time the Great Comet passed wouldn't be for another 44 years. And obviously the point of this is that this is Sozin finding out ahead of time that the comet he's going to use to do his big thing, start the war, he knows when it's coming. But they put the wrong year in the book. It has been confirmed by Randy Rabai that this is a typo. He called it a typo, not necessarily an error. He didn't even say what the correction is, but I'm guessing, based on the fact that they admitted to this effectively, that what most people are considering to be the correct thing is the correct thing. It should say 66, with the logic being that this is 16-year-old Sozin finding out about this. Sozin is 82 when he uses the comet to start the war, which is 66 years after this. The logic behind that being that, of course, he uses the comet 12 years after Roku dies. Roku dies at 70, and Sozin and Roku are the same age. So that's the logic there. Don't know how they got this wrong. Like it's a pretty bad like year error to get wrong, because if you look at any sort of timeline stuff in Avatar, what is 0 on the timeline that all the fandom uses? It's 0 BG, as in like 0 comet. It's the 0 point on the timeline. You shouldn't be messing this up, but they said it's going to be corrected in future print runs. That's obviously very difficult to find out when the new print run of a book is coming out. As far as I'm aware, the Kindle version that I have, the digital copy, has not been corrected since, so not sure what the situation is there. But what are your thoughts on this? I suppose just the plot details of, okay, he finds out about the comet in the library, but also then the error that was in the original text.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's things can slip through cracks pretty easily in sort of bigger projects. So, but that is unfortunate considering that is sort of like a key thing of just the whole series in general, just sort of the comment and how that changed everything in the war. So, I don't know. That's unfortunate that that error is there. I mean, I'm sure they will eventually get towards, sort of updating it. Publishing and updating stuff does take time, even in the digital, where you would think it would be a quick thing. It takes a lot of systems there, but at least they're aware of it. They know about it and they will change it. But I think it's interesting that this is the point where he's getting this sort of information and he knows, when he could potentially do something really big with the Fire Nation. Would this have still have gone down if Roku was still around? I don't know. There's more speculation there. Did he ever have an instance when he did use a solar flare, even though they are pretty unpredictable? Like, is that when he did take up for that sort of one town, before things while Roku was still around? I don't know. That might be an interesting little tidbit if that was sort of the case there. But yeah, I think it's just, it's something to see where he's sort of getting these ideas for the grander scheme of the Fire Nation and what they, or at least what in his mind, what they could really do for the rest of the world.
Hmm. Then we get the list of things that he thought about as legends, but turn out to not be the case. The first one is that slaying a dragon does not increase your firebending by 1,000-fold. It doesn't have any impact on your bending beyond, and then it doesn't have any impact on anything beyond the fact that, one, you've killed a sort of sacred beast animal. And then it also says here, and that it angered other dragons and disturbed their spiritual kin and the fire sages. Which I think is an interesting wording, because I'm like, spiritual kin. Do you just mean spirits, or do you mean like specifically like spirit dragons with that wording? Is a kind of interesting thing there. But this is huge because he knows that this is the case, but will still go on to introduce hunting dragons at some point in the next 12 years, because hunting dragons is a thing in the RPG, which is when Sozin's like 28, so he just decides to reintroduce this at a certain point, which is kind of an interesting thing with the dragons, where like he doesn't have his yet, Roku doesn't have his yet, so I guess he gets his dragon and then is like, let's take out other dragons so other people don't have dragons. That seems to be the sort of thing that Sozin would do, just to get any threats out of his way. But what are your thoughts on that hunting dragon kind of plot point here?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess, the Fire Nation in general is sort of waning from the more sort of spiritual side of things. So this, feels like this goes in line with that sort of idea, just sort of taking them out for their own sort of means or for his own sort of purposes, and the sort of control, I guess sort of information essentially, and what they can sort of really do. Especially if he, sort of learned that there's, some things that you can learn from the dragons, in terms of your own sort of firebending and your sort of abilities and stuff like that. Like, this seems like something that, he would want to, like you're saying, he would want to sort of control. And, is already sort of, not really caring about sort of the fire stages in general, especially since they essentially took, Roku away from him in this sort of case, telling that he's the avatar. So he's not necessarily on that sort of, I guess you could say, wavelength, in terms of that side of things. So yeah, definitely, it seems like something that he would do. I mean, it seems kind of odd considering he has a dragon, or he does get a dragon eventually. So you would think maybe he wouldn't do it, but I guess he's on the deep side as soon as he gets towards that sort of way of thinking, maybe.
Mm-hmm. And then they do also make a point here to be like, that lava bending is an earth bending technique, and that like technically firebenders can do stuff in relation to it, but it's literally just sort of forcibly melting a rock. Like you are not, once you melt the rock, you then can't bend it, is the kind of point here. It's not actual manipulation of lava, quote unquote. It's just you've melted something. It's an important distinction to make, because I think so many fans do latch on to the idea that like lava bending is related to fire because of this reason and that reason, when it's like, nope, you're kind of not thinking about it in the right way. So I think this explanation does a good job of like really refocusing it, that like no, it's an earthbending technique. It just so happens that lava is kind of hot. That's the only real heat connection in this. But what are your thoughts on that? Just specifically making a note of pointing that out.
Yeah, that's funny that they're just throwing it in there just so that you're rather clear on it. I mean, I don't know. I think for me that always seemed kind of clear because of I guess the form of matter that we're considering lava is, even though this is, a spiritual fantasy fictional world, so they could do whatever they really want with it if they really wanted to. But there's some basis in their sort of reality in terms of Avatar, which is why a lot of people sort of gravitate towards it, of course. So yeah, no, I think it's good that they note that there, like you could make lava, but you just can't do anything with it because it's not the same type of bending element as your own sort of element. So yeah, maybe it'd be cool if they could work together in terms of like making the lava and then sort of molding it. But earthbenders can sort of make sort of lava in that sort of way. So I don't know.
Mm-hmm. And then the final thing, he happens to come across this Zito era scroll that's called A Correction in Response to the Many Dangerous Falsehoods Perpetuated by the Dishonest Traveler, supposedly named Asho. And so Sozin is like, oh no. This is what I've been following to make everything happen. I've like sent Roku to this island on the basis of Asho's information, and now this scroll basically says he was lying about most of it. They don't confirm the exact details that he finds out here. They kind of more so do later on. But the point is that this is enough of a switch in information that Sozin immediately like runs out of the library basically and is like, we got to get some eel hands and like get out of here straight away. Whereas his companions were expecting him to probably stay in there for like a week or something like that because he's super into the scrolls, but he has to cut it short because Roku might die, and despite changes in the dynamic, it still is his best friend, and that's the kind of key point that they make here right at the end. Just because they only confirm it sort of later on in the middle of stuff. Basically what gets pointed out here, I think, in the text here is just that the enhancement is exclusive to the cave. Like you can't carry the energy out, and so it's sort of useless in the way that Sozin wants to use it, where he thought he'd just learn something and be enhanced, whereas no, you're enhanced in a specific cave, and you can only do so much with that. And then the other point is that it is mentioned that the inhabitants do kill outsiders, and so that's why Roku's at risk. They're the kind of two main things that he seems to find out in the scroll, along with probably some other stuff, but that's the details there. So yeah, what are your thoughts on the end of this chapter? The Asho being a liar, basically, and Sozin on his way back to the island now.
Yeah. I mean, Asho stories. I mean, I guess, who knows, what stories are being told and what's true and what's sort of false. So, I think, Sozin was going on the information that he had at the time, and, it seemed like, at least to him, it seemed like good sort of information. So yeah, I mean, I guess it's interesting that the corrections to that is in like the one place where like barely anyone will ever be able to get to. So, Asho's story is, as far as anyone else knows, is the truth of the matter here. But, maybe he did that on purpose to sort of protect the island for those who, were curious enough to sort of find it. I don't know. It doesn't really seem like that worked out if that was what he was sort of going for, but, that's what it sort of is here. But, it's interesting to see, Sozin is still sort of the friend in this sort of case here. He definitely wants to sort of help Roku in what he thinks is a dire sort of situation, since, he kind of already almost sort of killed his best friend inadvertently. So, he seems to not want to make that mistake again, which I think is, the good choice here.
Yeah, that kind of brings up an interesting point of like, yeah, well, what if Wan Shi Tong, had a very important document that sort of like a nation like really, really needed? Like, it's just like, can we get that? Like, can you give us the Declaration of Independence back, please? Or no, you holding on to it there, Wan Shi Tong? Okay. It's just a fun prospect of like, is he actually stealing this stuff? Does stealing mean anything to him when it comes to knowledge? Probably not.
Yeah.
But next chapter 25, is called Sharp Knife. So we're back with Malaya. She breaks free of the earthbending that she's been trapped in. is very frustrated at the betrayal because they wouldn't listen to her, but still doesn't want them to be killed, of course, is the main thing. She doesn't hate them. She's just frustrated by them. This is when Gyatso kind of spots her from up in the sky because, of course, Roku's just taken out the waterbender, so the fog is gone. So now you can actually see stuff on the island. So Gyatso lands next to her. It's pretty cautious because, of course, she's just had a bad run-in with outsiders. Here's another outsider. But Gyatso just starts talking and just relentlessly about him and Roku. He's trying to kind of make her at ease, but she's still suspicious and keeping the knife up. But they're going to travel together because they kind of need to go to the same places, basically. And then one of the other details is that I think this is the first time we get the name of the clan as being the Lombok clan. I think this is the first time that name comes up. But that's just the details here. So it's just the idea that, oh, Roku is alone and ends up on the island, like at the heart of the island, with Ulo, basically, on his side of the story, whereas Gyatso is actually meeting up with Malaya. Those two are now going to be paired up on another side of the story, which I think is super interesting, where like the people she really focused on as good outsiders were bad, and then this unexpected outsider ends up being a very close friend of hers is I think an interesting plot point. But what are your thoughts on Sharp Knife?
Yeah, no, it's nice to see this sort of initial meeting of characters here and how, how their relationship develops over the short period of time that they get to know each other here. No, Gyatso definitely feels like he's just sort of your standard sort of, airbender, outgoing type of character, very reminiscent of Aang, which kind of makes sense considering he was Aang's master. So like it sort of fits that sort of mold here where he just sort of, walks up to a character that is, kind of on edge around you, but, eventually over time you're able to sort of, wear them down. So I like that, Malaya's sort of, very hesitant, like you said, considering her last sort of meeting with outsiders didn't really go that well. But, Gyatso being an airbender, being a pacifist, being, someone who just wants to sort of know things and be interested in the area and glad that he can actually see things without the sort of fog all around. He's just able to sort of, break down these walls little by little here, and eventually they sort of keep together here.
Mm-hmm. Also, another Gyatso pie reference here, where he immediately thinks of, maybe I could put this new star apple fruit in a pie, and she's like, what's a pie? Because she missed the invention of a pie being on this island, which is a fun dynamic, whereas that's the chief agricultural product of the air nomads is pies. But chapter 26 is Embers Going Grey. Pretty short chapter here. Roku wakes up and is greeted by Ulo. So he's been saved from the sacred cave and brought to kind of Ulo's kind of hut, basically. And he's obviously in the heart of the clan's village here. Ulo's giving him this tea to help him recover his energy, apparently. And he also tells him that the waterbenders are okay. They just quickly go over, like, you weren't trying to kill them, right? No, it was an accident. They have healers here, waterbender healers. That's why everyone is okay. And Ulo somehow knows that Roku is the Avatar. And this surprises Roku because obviously he hasn't really been publicly announced to the world as the Avatar. And this place is also very isolated as well. So how does he know that? Now, there is a bit of a weird point here where apparently throughout this whole book, Roku is wearing air nomad robes. You have to look through the book with fine detail to actually get the confirmation on what he's wearing. But he is a primarily firebender wearing air nomad robes, and Ulo has been off island, so he'd know that. So that kind of gives it away. But I see the point that the book is trying to make here, because they're going to introduce a kind of interesting concept in like a chapter or two's time, but we'll get to that. This is kind of like the last chapter, just meant to highlight that Roku's plot point being separated from Gyatso is that he ends up now interacting with Ulo. So they each have to kind of interact with the two main characters on the native side of things. But what are your thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that he has on, his side, his native person that he's going to have to sort of interact with on the island and sort of, use this as his means of getting information. But, instead of him being able to sort of, talk a lot because he's just gone through this sort of ordeal here is, Ulo, who's able to sort of, understand sort of who, Roku really is, and give him, a little bit of information here, even if he's too weak to really sort of, do anything with it at this point in time. He's just sort of, recovering, and they have these waterbenders that are able to sort of heal them, which is a good thing to note because you almost sort of, I don't know, even though it's a small village and that they don't have a lot of benders, you sometimes think that there's not that many that they would have, ones that can do other things other than the, their primary use, the fog and everything like that. So it's interesting to hear that there is a good bit of them in the village, even if it is pretty small.
Mm. Yeah, and then there's also like on the native side of things, it's like, oh, they kill all outsiders, but like, how are you going to do that with the Avatar? Like, are you just okay with killing him because he's an outsider? And then like, the Avatar like
Yeah.
predates the nations and stuff like that, so you can't really accuse Roku of like that sort of stuff. And we obviously get the idea as we'll go through the book. There, Rulo has a plan with the Avatar. I'm not sure it gets fleshed out super well, as one of the kind of plot points in the book, but we'll get to it later on. But we'll continue on. Next chapter is chapter 27, Infested with Such Decay. So back with Malaya and Gyatso. Gyatso continues to just talk. In this case, we find out that he's basically told Malaya everything about interacting with Roku, why they've ended up here, why they're now separated. She knows the whole story. She's barely said anything to him. He does then bring up to her the Air Nomad philosophy of harmonies, and the idea that everyone kind of is vibrating at a frequency, and sometimes these frequencies can kind of like resonate together, and this highlights like a good connection. And the idea is that, oh, Roku and Gyatso seem to have this harmony together, and that's likely why Gyatso is able to kind of airbend when he has to help Roku, and that, this is why they feel attached to each other, and the fact that they both have like a key loss in their past and are helping each other through it adds to that. This is where Malaya is like, okay, I'm going to go back to the village. You can't come with me because you're an outsider. So you stay here and I'll come back to you. And when she comes back, she has no information about where the Earthbenders are. And she knows that Ulo wasn't there this time. So they just decide that, okay, I guess we'll wait and see what happens here, because we sort of need to investigate to figure out what we want to do next. Because Malaya's mission at this point is effectively make sure that her people basically don't kill the Earthbenders, don't kill the outsiders. That's kind of what's happening here. But you can see Gyatso and her already beginning to become a little bit closer, but she's still a bit standoffish in this chapter. But it's getting there. But what are your thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah, no, I think you definitely get that throughout the chapter that they're becoming more comfortable with each other. Like, they talk about the different sort of, food. We've mentioned that before, but even talking about sort of the animals, like they talk about her gorilla, Tarzir, and, sort of how unique that is. And, of course, Gyatso being all about animals is really sort of invested in that sort of idea. So yeah, there's definitely some sort of, connection, some kinship that's sort of happening here. As well as them just sort of, learning, or Gyatso learning, just finally learning a little bit more about the village and sort of, what's going on there, even if they're not sort of fully, know the full picture of things. So no, I thought it was a good way to sort of, just continue to build this sort of relationship here, which is, I guess, of course, sad considering where it ends up. But I think it's a good way for our characters to get together.
Mm-hmm. Next chapter is chapter 28, which is the Path of Least Resistance. So we're back with Roku and Ulo. So we get the explanation. How does Ulo know Roku is the Avatar? Ulo says it's because he can see Roku's aura, which burns like the sun. And Roku actually asks, like, wait, you can see my aura? And he's like, yeah. Now, they don't really cover it, like, exactly kind of here. They go into some of the details here about, like, what exactly do you mean by this? It begins to get brought up more and more as we go through the book here. There's one specific chapter later on where it gets addressed more directly, technically, in terms of like colors of auras and what that actually means, and that this is not just sort of the kind of emotion you're giving off. This is like the visual of your energy from like a bending point of view is kind of what we're talking about here. Like this is different than your spirit because it's related to like bending and physical stuff. Um, I just find it interesting, and there's a big discussion about, like, obviously, well, aura in Avatar, when you bring that up, you think it typically go Ty Lee, but they sort of address to a certain
Yeah.
degree in the chapter that, like, well, there's a difference between actually seeing someone's aura and then the sort of almost like mood interpretation kind of stuff that maybe she's doing, and which of these is the same or different and stuff like this. What are your thoughts on aura as it kind of gets brought up in the?
Yeah, no, I thought that was interesting because yeah, immediately I sort of think of Ty Lee and sort of her, her thoughts on it, and whose aura is dingy versus bright and vibrant, and how that sort of changes over time. But it definitely seemed to go here in this book, at least more towards the sort of spiritual, sort of bending, sort of sense of it, and how your how it reads and how it interacts with your sort of body. And I guess considering it being something that sort of was like a lost sort of technique from time that fire sages used to have, but has been sort of lost over time because as things have gone and progressed, people have lost some of their sort of spirituality and their connection to the spirits as humans have developed and evolved over time. So he's of course very sort of skeptical of this whole sort of situation, but no, I don't know. In my mind, it doesn't seem, too far-fetched that someone who, from what we're considering at least, is more sort of spiritually connected to their land and to their sort of spirits, even if they're sort of, as we learn later on, using those techniques in sort of the wrong sort of way and fashion, and maybe have become sort of a bit sort of corrupted as well. Um, would have this sort of ability to sort of read people in this sort of way. Maybe it's not as sort of good as it was in the past, but it's probably more in line than to what it used to be than sort of what the current sort of sages and current sort of spiritual leaders are actually capable of doing. Sort of what we've seen from sort of even in Korra's time with some of the islands and the people there. So I don't know. It wouldn't seem too far-fetched to me that this is something that he could do. But I think Roku is right to be hesitant about this whole sort of idea.
Mm. And it's interesting because, yeah, later on, we'll get during the kind of big fight the idea that fully enhanced Roku can see Ulo's aura and can see that his is like amber, I think is the color they present, and his own, he can see his own is blue. And it's like, okay, so when you're enhanced, you can do it, but then Ulo apparently can do it because I guess he has so much training with high energy, because I guess we get the confirmation that Ulo's not really spiritual himself because of the whole situation with like young Gib and the lies there. So it is more of just he is so attuned to like especially strong energies, I guess, on a very technical level he can see it rather than it being an incredibly spiritual thing. But it's interesting. I don't know if they're ever really going to delve into it too much because the like the big thing I did a video on this was like basically like the energy bending scene with like Aang and Ozai. Are the visuals that we're seeing there, is that their auras? I think it kind of makes sense because we're talking about energy. Aang's energy overtakes Ozai's and he takes his bending away. It feels like one of the few ways to maybe properly visually showcase it, but it's interesting. And then there's definitely some blue sapphire in Aang's aura there, and Korra's when she has some big Rava moments, but there's that. Otherwise, what happens in this chapter is just that they get to discussing the problem at hand of like Roku wants to resolve things peacefully, but Ulo is very still anti-outsider, and he kind of feels that Roku's maybe more siding with the outsiders over the island, and that maybe Roku's being a bit too idealistic about this, whereas we know Ulo wants to act and take out the outsiders, but he more or less just shuts down the discussion by telling Roku to rest. Doesn't really want to deal with this now because it is a subtle plot point in the background that the tea he's giving to Roku sort of weakens him. It keeps his energy kind of low. They explained this in a much earlier chapter that it's the Sampaguita tea, which actually kind of numbs people more so than anything. So that's a key point. But any thoughts on the actual discussion between Ulo and Roku?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something to see Roku trying to sort of get information without sort of being, direct. I like that he's learning from, how to sort of interact with people, or at least in sort of his, pseudo official, to become Avatar sort of mentality. He's, trying to sort of, get things without having to, be sort of the typical sort of, firebender sort of mentality, right? Like he even notes that earlier on of how he's, trying to get stuff without sort of, just going straight for it here. So I like that, Roku's learning how to act. He's becoming more sort of nuanced in his approach to things. He's able to, learn from other cultures, from Sister in terms of how to sort of work with people here. So no, I like that.
Hmm. Next chapter is chapter 29, Local Elements. We continue with Roku. He's actually shown around the village this time, and he gets to see that, oh yeah, it is a full-on mixed kind of bender community, and that's a very unique thing that he notes in history. None of these have really succeeded super kind of much in the past, so it's a credit to a certain degree of Ulo as a leader that he's been able to kind of make this happen. But we also get eventually to the idea that he's also very suspicious of Ulo, because Ulo specifically doesn't talk about specific things. He always kind of angles the conversation in a specific way so they don't have to address certain things, and he's definitely hiding quite a lot. Most notably here, he refuses really to properly address, where are the Earthbenders? Where are these outsiders that you keep talking about? And you almost can lose track of them, but the idea is that behind the scenes, they have been captured at this point. Like Amihan has like helped the rest of them capture the Earthbenders, and so yes, the clan does have those Earthbenders captured in the background here, but it doesn't get revealed for like quite a few chapters into the future here. It's a bit of a kind of odd mystery that you really have to keep a track of. We address a few other things like, the Benders on this island trained to use the cave empowerment from a very early age, and this is why, they're good at using it, and why Roku was like drained after just using it for like a second. This is also where we get confirmation you can't take the power with you out of the cave. It's just you are enhanced while you are in there, and that's it. They give a more sort of spiritual reason of like Yungib protects you in the cave, but you don't take it with you, but you actually just can't. That's not how it works. And that's the kind of the initial thing, is just like Roku really getting this insight into like, oh, this is a unique place. Like, I need to maybe stop thinking about this as like the nations, and I kind of do have to treat this island as its own independent thing. And it complicates potentially his role as the Avatar here, because he probably will have to advocate for the independence of this island. And he's beginning to open up and think about things in that way, that, maybe the nation borders aren't so kind of strict like we addressed with like Sister Disha in the first part of the discussion. But what are your thoughts on this initial kind of him being shown around the village and Roku's take on the...
Yeah, I think his takes are pretty good. I think he's, I don't know, maybe his time with the air nomads up until this point, or just him sort of evolving as a character, he's able to really sort of, see this community with sort of like open eyes almost. I don't know if sort of like the old previous Roku would have been able to do this as well, but I think he's definitely, he has some experience interacting with other people and seeing different cultures and stuff like that. So he's, he's doing a good job of getting a read on the situation and how he might actually be able to better support them in the future, using his title as the Avatar. So I like that he has that sort of, perspective here, and even can see sort of the fact that it's survived this long is just like a credit to sort of the leadership of the clan, to Ulo, just to the people in general, that this has been able to sort of survive this long. So I think this is it's another point in Roku's sort of journey of sort of understanding his role and sort of how it might be different than what he sort of thought it was in the beginning.
Then we have a bit of a chapter cut, and he then goes out at night wanting to kind of get away from Ulo and sort of inspect things on his own. So he goes down to the caves, and he sees the cave paintings that are on the walls that tell the kind of the story, the history of the clan. And he notes that there are kind of 4 separate stories that are all fairly similar, which is the idea that each of the 4 nations, kind of almost like one by one, come to the island and they wipe out one of the 5 clans on the island, leaving just one left, the Lombok clan. And Roku kind of is like, well, okay, people coming to the island, I get that. Maybe someone being wiped out makes sense for the Earth Kingdom. And even in his head is like, maybe even the Fire Nation would do something like that. But he doesn't think that's true, like, at all for the Water Tribe, and especially the Air Nomads. That just can't possibly be true. The Air Nomads would never, one, invade a place and kill everyone. No. So there's a lie here for sure. Then he gets to sort of the last story. And this is where Ulo actually arrives and just tells the story to him. This is the Awakening of Young Gib, which is the most important story in the history of the clan, which is Earthbenders attacking the clan, them being chased into the caves, Young Gib arriving, empowering the cave, giving the people the energy and the power needed to fight back, and they use the bending enhancement to wipe out the invaders. And now the clan, from this point on, uses the power to protect themselves, which is waterbenders making the fog. They mention here that the earthbenders reshape the coastlines each season to make it harder to get to the island. They just say the firebenders forge weapons, and then Roku asks about the airbenders, and Ulo gives a very vague answer about how they're flexible and how they help us, which, based on Amihan, I sort of take to be like, do they borderline like train them specifically to be like scouts or like assassins? Like that's almost how they view the airbenders, as like just almost the killers on the island. That's specifically what we do, but Ulo just doesn't want to say that. It's also weird that like it feels like really, really heavy power for like waterbenders fog over an entire island, reshape the coastlines for earthbenders, and just firebenders forge weapons. Like, I get it. I suppose technically they can maybe just do it on their own because they're enhanced. They can just heat it up super strong and maybe make amazing weapons, but feels like there's a better use for firebenders, and it goes back to like the initial legend of like they can move the sun or something like that. They never really say what that meant. But what are your thoughts on these stories here? The ones about the 4 nations, and then the specific awakening of young Gibbs.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels like it's a tailored history for a specific reason, but it also feels like to some degree it could be true. He notes that his own nation, would potentially do something like that, considering how, they currently act and how they might act in the future. But yeah, the one about the air nomads, that definitely, from everything that we know about the air nomads as of now, or at least history has told, that definitely feels like that's like the exact opposite of anything that they would do. And, Water Tribe definitely feels like they're more of a defensive group than sort of an offensive sort of power. So it definitely, feels like there's some plot holes in that sort of history story there, but I'm sure there's some nuggets of truth in it, even if there's no real way to sort of know the truth of it, which is sort of the hard thing in this sort of situation, because, especially with a story that's sort of, passed orally through one sort of person, there's no other sort of way of getting the real sort of story there. So who knows what the real way to do it actually is. But, it is cool to see how they all sort of work together to sort of protect the island. Like, that is a nice idea, even if it does seem, like you're saying, a little bit sort of lackluster of what, firebenders could do, especially since we can see, offensively, what they can do when they're, empowered by the cave, there directly. Now, would there be something there that they could do, towards the island? I don't know. I'm sure there's some sort of way they could use them to sort of reshape things, making lava or melting rock or whatever. But yeah, I mean, it's cool to see what the story is, at least from this perspective of how they've survived up until this point.
Mm. Yeah, and then I suppose, do you take reshaped coastlines as basically being lava bending? Like that's kind of like the only way to really accomplish that properly?
I don't know. That's a good point there. I mean, from what we've seen of lava bending, right? Like, we see how, destructive it can be in terms of, like just taking out a whole air temple, for example. So like, it definitely feels like it has that sort of power. But I don't know. In my mind, when I first heard it, at least, I didn't really think of it in terms of like them, using lava bending to sort of reshape the coastline. I mean, I mean, I wouldn't think that, even if there's like a collective group, they're going to pull a Kyoshi and sort of like, move the whole island a little bit or whatever. But no, I could see them, considering, how they said when they sort of arrived at the island, how like if they would have, flown directly into it, they would have, flown directly into like a rock face or anything like that. Like I could see them having the ability to sort of, reshape, literally like different parts of the coast and bring things up from the ocean floor or whatever to sort of, create a different outline of the island to make it harder for people to sort of, land on the island. Like that seems like something, if we're considering how the enhancement works, at least together they could do that. I mean, Earthbenders seem like they can kind of do that on their own, even without the enhancement, like if they're close enough to the actual coastline or something like that. So that doesn't seem too far out of the range that they, could do even without, sort of going to the extreme of, say, using lava bending. That seems like something they might do for like the inner workings of the island in order to sort of, heat water or create sort of like, underwater sort of like places for geysers and stuff like that. Like that seems like something internal that they would do. Since, the cave is only like, it's local, right? So like, it depends on how far we're saying the powers consider extend and, just visually, like, how are they able to sort of sense that sort of thing? But who knows? Maybe the secret cave gives them the ability to sense farther or something like that. You don't know.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of implication, is that like if you get like a group of earthbenders in the sacred cave, they can probably like seismic sense the entire island and just control
Yeah,
any earth
maybe.
anywhere. Because I think when Roku and Gyatso crash on the island, don't they describe that like the kind of like the beach effectively almost has like these giant earth pillars like jutting out of it that like they barely avoid? I think it's something like that
Yeah.
that they mentioned. So it's something like that either way. Like the earthbenders put up defenses on the outsides. Final part of this chapter is that he mentions that the awakening of young Gib happened during the equinox, and so every year, but basically every equinox, so I guess twice a year, they do a ritual for the spirit young Gib to appreciate this. And Ulo wants Roku to join him in meeting young Gib this time because he feels that the Avatar was brought here for a reason. He wants him to be there to find out what that is. Roku agrees because he wants to figure out what's going on here, but he knows something's going on here. Doesn't know the full scope of it yet, but he's on guard, but knows that it's right to kind of go deeper on this ultimately. So this is cool by itself because we know about the solstices when it comes to avatars, like spiritual events, but then we have the kind of opposite equivalents of the equinoxes, which they effectively describe here as being just very similar things. Like the two worlds come closer together. I guess it just causes spiritual events at different areas of the world because of the nature of what happens. I'd love to know if there is a specific difference, but cool that they mentioned them here. But what's your thoughts on the ending of this chapter?
Yeah, the equinox and how is this going to work with Roku and the Avatar, and is he there for a reason and stuff like that? I don't know. I like that they're sort of incorporating him, being here, or he's trying to say that he's there for sort of a reason here. And I like that Roku, despite everything, he's still, a pretty good sort of like, thinker in general. Like he can discern things. He can see things from different sides. Like he does have a blind spot in Sozin, of course, which is understanding considering their sort of history there. But he's piecing things together in the best way he can with the information that he has. And even though he's not 100% that we know of as the viewer, there's some logic, some reasoning to what he's doing and wanting to find out more information about this island and how he can sort of do his job as the Avatar. So no, I think that's good that they're sort of going back and forth here with what's really happening and what's not really happening here. Him pulling sort of all of the knowledge that he has from his current master in order to sort of figure things out.
Mm-hmm. We then move on to chapter 30, which is called Marauding Bands of Airbenders. So we're back to Malaya and Gyatso. So she's made another trip into the village, and she returns to reveal that Roku's safe. He's just with Ulo showing him around. I don't think he has like freedom to really walk around, but there doesn't seem to be any issue going on. But both of them are like convinced, based on what like Malaya knows, that well, the Avatar's an outsider. He's probably going to try and kill him at some point. I can't see any specific way he wants to use the Avatar. Malaya, also because Gyatso's told her a lot about air nomad culture, now understands another kind of group of lies that Ulo has told them about the air nomads. This is where the chapter title drop happens about the marauding bands of airbenders, which the air nomads are most certainly not. She knows that just from interacting with Gyatso and how so many of their philosophies are about peace. Like they won't eat meat like at all. Like it's all of this stuff. There's no way any of that is true, and so it kind of solidifies it in her head that she's right to question a lot of what's going on with Ulo, and that her kind of faith in outsiders is kind of restored a little bit more as well with Gyatso, at least when it comes to air nomads at the very least. And then we just get a bit more of a personal bit at the end where Gyatso is very worried about Roku, like what if Ulo kills him? Malaya assures him it will be okay. She then asks a very kind of personal question, like, what about your sister? You know, who was the person that you lost? And she really worries that, like, oh, have I overstepped here? Like, do I know him well enough to ask this? And she really feels like she might have messed up her potential friendship with Gyatso here for a while. But then he just laughs and is like, oh, no, it's just I was thinking about what Roku said to me about kind of loving my sister now that she's gone. And then he actually tells Malaya about Yama. Now, we will get the story of this later when it gets relayed to Roku. But it's interesting that Gyatso actually told Malaya first, in terms of that kind of harmony thing, that Gyatso actually has a very strong connection with Malaya. These two have that really strong kind of connection here, and you can see that here, as well as I think a quite interesting character point with Malaya, where with Roku's parents, I think they make it relatively clear what the situation is with the funeral. There's a very odd, mysterious thing going on with Malaya and her family that I don't think the book does a good enough job at like surfacing what it actually is, where you do have to latch on to moments like this where she feels like trying to form a kind of personal attachment with Gyatso, asking him this question about his sister. She really feels like, I think I've messed it up completely. Like, it's not like a super normal reaction she has to asking that question, but what are your thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, her relationship with her family and just the tribe in general. I mean, they make note of that, and we've mentioned that because that's why she's such a sort of good scout, and she's able to be away from normally the people that you would really want to be around. So she has this sort of barrier there. And that's sort of what she sort of keys in here at the end here, where you're saying that she, thought that she messed up, sort of asking maybe a too bit of a personal question to Gyatso here, even though he sort of laughs it off here. Because she really, she makes note that she doesn't really have, a lot of, like, you could say, like, social grace and when it comes to interacting with people. But, they have this sort of connection, which I think you get, comes across pretty clear in this chapter. Just sort of how well they get on with each other, how they just sort of seem to sort of click here. And even this sort of, question that, would necessarily be a really sort of too personal question, considering all the sort of, build up that we have, in terms of, this being sort of the thing that's been holding Gyatso's back, from his sort of airbending. He sort of is finally able to sort of let go and figure out a better way to love his sister now that she's not here anymore. So I like that they, have that sort of resolution here. They have that sort of, extra moment of connection between these two characters, just within these, what is it, like 3 chapters that they've really been together, which is, a couple of days at this point.
Yeah, because like I think so far in the book, some of the main things with her that we get is like, she mentioned that like she sort of feels pressured by her parents to kind of find someone to marry, but it only gets that's only mentioned like once in like one chapter right at the very beginning, and she doesn't interact with her family enough to where she maybe would hear that too much. She's a scout, so she's already like separated from everyone else. And you sort of wonder, like, is that purposeful to keep her away from her family, or is that purposeful with the scouts that they do that because they're meant to be killers, basically? But then the big thing with her is probably just that it seems like Ulo and the kind of cult-like aspect of the clan doesn't like the idea that here's a character who very much kind of like looks outward at the rest of the world and is interested in that and wants to kind of stop that at all costs. And there is the mention earlier on that she was punished like once or twice when she was younger for asking about the inconsistencies in his stories. So there's that sense of like she almost doesn't feel like she can fully speak her mind. But yeah, they don't quite address why there's no strong connection with her with anyone else, like because they note that like later on she'll see like the reunion of Roku and Gyatso, and then she'll have a similar moment kind of with Gyatso, and that's like the first time she's getting that. And is it just her parents being weird or what? Like it felt like something more was needed. Even if you address the bonus chapter, the kind of cut chapter from the limited edition, they add a little bit more, but it's mostly kind of Malaya going like, oh yeah, my situation is actually similar to yours, Roku, where it's more just general pressures from the kind of family environment that I'm in. And it's noted that like her pressure is like more than kind of everyone else, because I guess she's a scout, she has to be separated from everyone. It's weird because like we there's another point as well where she mentions like, oh, like they're my two brothers. I don't really know them, but they're my brothers, and that's like, oh, is that just normal? But then you get like, no, there's other family members that are kind of close together, like Baku and his son seem like they're relatively close. So I don't know. It's just maybe one of those things where they cut something out and forgot to put something back in. But there's other big Malaya moments as we kind of go through future chapters overall. So the last chapter we're going to cover today is chapter 31, which is called The Difference. So there's an interesting part at the start here where Roku once again reflects on the past and how after Yasu's death, he went on leave for the remainder of that semester, and actually Sozin did the same to sort of, I suppose, be with and be around Roku more. And he did that even though his father was very aggressive, trying to make him go back to the school, basically. And that this is where we get that idea of the death of Yasu, it says here, it halved Roku, but it doubled Sozin. And Sozin was even more direct in everything that he wanted to do after this, and even more driven, whereas Roku kind of still kind of trailed behind a little bit after this. But it's very much noted that if Sozin wasn't there, this would have been like an awful period of Roku's life. It already was, but without Sozin it would have been a bit of a disaster. So it just is further highlighting the significance in Roku's life for Sozin at this point, but that there was still this very big difference between the two of them, that there kind of still is, and we're only now beginning to see Roku kind of have his true development into the avatar we know he will go on to be. But what are your thoughts on this interesting reflection here at the start of this chapter?
Yeah, no, I thought this was cool to get to see. I mean, I think these chapters there, or these parts, are really good because they show the relationship that these two have had and why Roku is so for Sozin in terms of trusting him with everything that he says. Pretty much on face value for the most part, because he really was sort of the person to sort of hold him together, because it definitely feels like his parents just sort of, receded into the background here when Roku, sort of was dealing with, sort of the bereavement and everything here, and, Sozin becoming more sort of driven. It makes you wonder, sort of how things would have turned otherwise. Would things have been, a bit more balanced if this sort of situation didn't happen? But no, it did, and this is where we're sort of at with these characters here. So it's definitely I know it's one of those things where it's like it's good to see sort of what's happened in the past, and it makes it sort of so much sadder when things actually turn out bad.
Hmm. The kind of main part of this chapter is there's a hog monkey attack on the village, which is kind of caused by Malaya and Gyatso, of course. Um, and in the chaos, Gyatso like appears before Roku because Ulo kind of leaves to investigate what's going on, and Gyatso's like, "Hey, come with me, really, really quick. We can talk about things later." But they both have this kind of argument here where they are each basically saying to each other, "Hey, no, trust me on this. You don't know all the information." And the other one's like, "No, you don't know all the information. You got to trust me." And eventually Gyatso manages to get through that, like, "Hey, I think it's important that you kind of get away from Ulo for a little bit. You can come back after you hear what we have to say, but just you need to hear what me and Malaya have to say." And Roku's like, "Who's Malaya?" They're both still mad about the argument, but Gyatso does give this initial apology here at this point, and as Roku does decide to go with him. So we're obviously building up to next chapter. Effectively, we're going to get the big proper apology emotional scene, but for now this is the setup towards that. And I do like this, where it's just like it was a major disagreement here, and separately they've both come to different conclusions, and they obviously can't convince each other, but it's like, yeah, I think Roku does need to be away from Ulo for like a little bit. So we get the right outcome here, but I think it's nicely done, that argument they have, kind of Gyatso hanging in the window, basically. But what are your thoughts on this sequence?
Yeah, no, it's a fun one here just because, there's all this sort of chaos going on and they're, trying to be fast about the situation, but both of them think they're right and both of them have a point to make, and, everyone's sort of feelings have been hurt before, so they're both, don't want to necessarily give an inch, but they're not that mad really at each other that they won't sort of at least consider or at least listen to the other. Like they're not coming to blows or anything like immediate like or anything like that. So no, and I think going along the lines of what you said before, where maybe Gyatso might have been a little bit too harsh in the situation, is sort of the first one to sort of try to make amends and try to bridge, sort of the gap in terms of, sort of, the hurtful feelings that were said before, which just, kind of feels like sort of on air nomad brand to sort of be in this sort of situation. So no, I think that was a good way to sort of, get them to sort of at least be able to have sort of like a sit down conversation about everything that sort of happened before, to sort of get a better picture of things, because they both like you're saying, they both think they know what's happening, but they don't really know, and there's more happening. So I like that they're at least able to start to mend the bridge, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the big thing, obviously, it gets pointed out in the next chapter, is that like you two can't really make up until Gyatso, you explain to Roku like why what you said during the argument was so bad. Like Roku just has no clue what he's actually done to like really annoy Gyatso, apart from just like, "I've said my friend is my friend and I trust him," and that's not super bad. But there is the requirement of like, yeah, you should probably tell him what you told me, which is obviously important for the next chapter, that yeah, it's going to be Roku and Malaya meeting for the first time as well, and her getting to see the two of them interact, given that Gyatso has filled her in on every single detail about their relationship up to this point. So yeah, important next chapter coming up, where the kind of three main kind of teenage characters, the team avatar for this book, are properly going to all come together, which is exciting. It's also this is in or around the point where if the cut chapter was actually part of the main book, it'd be in or around this time where it happens as well. But yeah, that's what we're doing here. That's the 2/3 way through the book. And as I mentioned at the start, yes, we're 31 chapters in, but there's still like 20 something chapters left. But it's the same amount of pages we're going to cover. It's kind of pretty crazy that there is like 7 or 8 like 1-2 page chapters in the like next half of the book. There's some very, very quick ones once the kind of final sequence ends up happening. It makes sense. I think they do them reasonably well, but it's just very noticeable by the numbers how many chapters are still left in the book. But yeah, I think that the setup is pretty good. I would say outside of probably just the Earthbenders and like they're a little bit too secretive about like what's happened to them. I feel like they almost should have
Mhm.
revealed already that like, oh yeah, this is what happened to the Earthbenders, instead of figuring it out in like 2 or 3 chapters time. Because you do lose sight of them, and it's kind of important that like say Yuming and Chija. There's also a weird thing where the author for whatever reason just sometimes refuses to name them by name or even refer to them as the mother and the daughter. So it's just like when we say the Earthbenders, are we talking about the guards, the mother and the
Mm.
daughter, or both together? And there's some weirdness there to the point where even into like the end of the book, you're almost like, oh yeah, 2 Earthbenders got off the island. Oh wait, it's those 2 characters, the name characters. Um, that they could just be a little better about that, where like you can easily, I think, read this book one time and completely forget those 2 characters exist. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on those 2 characters specifically? Having gone through this book a bit, like what is your memory of Yuming and Chija?
Yeah, no, it's funny because they, it feels like they would be rather important to things because they're the ones that are actually like interested on being on the island and like learning the secrets and stuff like that. Um, but they really do, I guess in terms of like, they're just a vehicle because they would be the ones that would tell, higher ups about all the cool stuff on the island, but the ones that are actually doing like the damage and that we're sort of upset about are the sort of security guards, right? So those are the ones that, feel like they're the ones that, when they're talking about like the earthbenders that are like, damaging and hurting us and that will really cause the problems. It's the security guards, which, one is really badly injured, two are captured, and the other ones are just with the other sort of researcher, the mother and daughter there. So it does feel like sometimes where it does seem like they could tell at least a little bit more about what's happening or who's who in terms of, who do the island people hate. But I guess, from the islanders' perspectives, they're all sort of the same, right? Like they're all bad apples that are going to bring trouble either, directly because they're willing to sort of fight and kill, to protect people, to protect the two researchers, or they're going to bring other people that are going to do even worse things to the island. So I guess I could see why they're trying to sort of lump them together, but in terms of like which ones are actually in danger, is the security guards that are the ones that are in danger and that, do the most damage in the end.
Hmm. Yeah, it's just like going into book 2. It's like these feel like characters who are going to be in book 2 because they seem to be kind of pitting almost like Dallasay against these two from like a research perspective to a certain
Yeah,
degree.
yeah.
But you come out of it and it's like, did those two make it off the island? After my first read through, I was definitely like, do they get like named or directly referred to again? And they eventually do. They do acknowledge it. But it's just you gotta pay attention to some of the more subtle kind of plot points here. But yeah, that is the 2/3 way through the book, and next podcast we'll go through the remainder of the book to the end. But yeah, that has been episode 279 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye bye.